Cade brought the newly formed club down with all the force he could muster, aiming for the seam where Brahm's front and back plates met. White fire exploded from the front opening of the tortoise's shell. The jet struck the ground at an angle, blasting against the earth and pushing against Brahm's own armored bulk. The massive shell skidded a fraction of an inch, but it was enough. Cade's strike glanced off target. Instead of slamming into the vulnerable seam, the club smashed against the curve of the shell and rebounded violently. The impact jarred his arms and sent a shock through his shoulders. The wood held, but the blow had accomplished nothing. He reset his footing, preparing to strike again. Then he saw the flames shift. The white jet pivoted, causing the large shell to begin to rotate slowly along its belly. Then the fire intensified, extending farther, pushing harder. The rotation quickened. Cade backpedaled immediately as his eyes widened. Brahm was simultaneously hiding within his shell while attacking in every direction via his white flames to force Cade away from the vulnerable parts of his shell. The white flames blasted outward in a continuous stream, driving the tortoise's body into a faster and faster spin. The heavy shell scraped and ground against the earth, picking up speed as the flames roared from its front opening like the exhaust of some hellish engine. Cade backpedaled even further back, giving the flaming rotating tortoise space. He wasn't eager to test whether his strange resistance would hold up inside a spinning inferno. The flames lashed outward in widening arcs as the rotation increased. 5 meters, then 10, as the blazing white stream stretched farther and farther with every revolution. Cade was forced to retreat again and again, bare feet skidding across the scorched ground as the rotating shell transformed into a spinning top of desolation. Vegetation vanished instantly. Root tendrils, patches of moss, stray growth, everything caught in the expanding radius was reduced to nothing but fine white ash. Then the flames abruptly cut off, but the shell did not stop spinning. Freed from the counterforce of the fire, it rotated even faster for several seconds, inertia carrying it forward. The motion churned the newly created ash into the air, whipping it into a tightening spiral around the tortoise's body. The spinning shell became the eye of a growing storm. Ash lifted from the ground in sheets. Loose particulates from the battlefield joined the vortex, spiraling higher and thicker with each passing second. Some of it funneled inward toward the tortoise's breathing holes, but most of it simply whirled outward in a violent cyclone. Cade squinted as visibility dropped. Within moments he was completely engulfed. White particulates filled the air, stinging his eyes and trying to invade his lungs. The world dissolved into a swirling whiteout as wind tore at his bare skin. He swung his club blindly in front of him, hoping to connect with something solid, but he struck only air. From the heart of the ash storm, a deep, resonant laugh rolled outward. "You have battled well," Brahm's voice boomed through the vortex, thick with pride and fury. "But you are no match for my ultimate technique." The whines intensified. "Behold and be consumed by my ashen vortex." The gale roared. Ash slammed into Cade from every direction. It coated his bare skin and pressed against his face and arms like abrasive sandpaper. He felt it trying to bite. Trying to burrow into him. The club in his hand grew lighter. He looked down just in time to see the dark wood pale, then crumble. The swirling ash gnawed at it relentlessly, devouring the heartwood until it disintegrated into the same fine white powder whipping through the storm. Cade staggered backward, shielding his face with his forearm as the vortex swallowed him whole. He kept backing up blindly, one hand shielding his eyes as the ashen vortex howled around him. The storm seemed anchored to Brahm at its center, yet wherever Cade moved, the whiteout followed. He couldn't see more than a meter in front of him. The world had become nothing but swirling particulate and screaming air. Then his back struck something solid. He nearly stumbled from the sudden stop but caught himself, palm slapping against rough bark. A root pillar. Even through the ash storm he could feel its immense solidity at his back, the living foundation of the great tree rising upward beyond sight. Everything else was being stripped bare. He watched in grim disbelief as bark from the pillar began to flake away. Fine layers peeled off under the relentless assault, torn free and converted into more ash that joined the vortex. The ground at his feet was already buried beneath a growing layer of white powder. The entire hollow was being reduced to fuel for Brahm's technique. Cade braced himself against the root, waiting for the ash to begin dissolving him too. The ash swarmed him. It coated his arms, his chest, his face. It crawled along his skin, pressing into his pores. He expected pain. Expected to feel it gnaw through him the way it had devoured his club. Instead, his skin prickled. That was it. A tingling irritation. Like fine dust dragged across sunburned flesh. It tried to cling to him, tried to burrow into his body, but it didn't take. The ash slid off him in thin sheets, unable to find purchase. Cade blinked through the whiteout, realization dawning slowly. The ashen baptism, the first part of his body tempering. When he had first stumbled through the ashen wastes, the Emperor's ash had eaten through him in seconds. Hollowed him out until he was a mere shell of his former self. He could still remember the agony, skin blistering, flesh being consumed as if he were nothing more than dry tinder. That ash from the Ashen Emperor had nearly killed him, but it hadn't. Instead it had purged everything out from Cade's body and left him covered in a sticky black tar-like substance. Brahm's ash was nothing compared to that of the Ashen Emperor. Cade's skin easily resisted its corrosion. The vortex raged for a full minute. A relentless cyclone of desolation meant to grind him down into nothing but white ash. Cade endured it, back pressed to the root pillar, eyes narrowed against the storm. His breathing grew labored, not from the ash invading his lungs, but from the sheer force of the wind and particulate battering him from all sides. Yet beneath the assault, he remained intact. No burning flesh or dissolution of his body. Just that persistent prickling of the ash trying, but ultimately failing, to dig into him. Gradually, the winds weakened. The vortex thinned from a roaring cyclone to a heavy spiral. The ash lost cohesion, drifting downward in thick, exhausted waves. Through the fading storm, Cade heard it. Laughter. Deep gravelly laughter rang out in the hollow. Brahm was laughing, but it wasn't triumphant. It was strained with the effort of the technique he had just released. But there was a certainty to it. The ash settled further, visibility improving in slow increments. The swirling white curtain parted enough for Cade to make out the blurred silhouette of the tortoise at the storm's center. Brahm's heavy breathing was audible now, each inhale more laborious than the last. Cade straightened from the root pillar. Across the hollow, Brahm stood swaying slightly on his feet, chest heaving. The ground around him was scoured clean. The tortoise's laughter tapered off into a wheezing exhale. Then his ember-like eyes focused fully on Cade. The certainty in them vanished as the tortoise's laughter cut off. Brahm's exhaustion remained, and it was now joined by disbelief. "How did you?" Brahm rasped. His legs trembled, and then the massive tortoise collapsed forward onto the ash-covered ground with a heavy thud, unconscious. Cade didn't move at first. He stood there in the ash, chest rising and falling, eyes locked on Brahm's motionless form. The massive tortoise lay sprawled on his stomach, limbs half extended, head turned to the side. He waited for the trick to play out. For the sudden snap of jaws when he least expected. An explosive counterattack as Cade approached. But nothing came. The hollow was eerily quiet now. The roar of the vortex had faded into faint drifting ash settling across the ground like snowfall. The falling white particles were almost beautiful in their descent, soft, weightless, luminous in the filtered light, yet haunting in what they represented. Every delicate flake had once been life, bark, vine, moss, fragile growth within the hollow, all reduced to powder and carried on the wind. Slowly, carefully, Cade stepped forward. Each step felt heavier than the last. His legs trembled from exhaustion. His head throbbed in a slow, punishing rhythm behind his eyes. When he was close enough to see the shallow rise and fall of Brahm's chest, he stopped. The tortoise was truly unconscious. This was it. This was his chance. He could end the destroyer right here, right now. No risk of Brahm recovering and hunting him or the frogs later. No Ashen Front arriving at the village because he'd spared the first scout. Cade's jaw tightened. With his intent sharpening in his mind, he reached inward for the rhizome. He willed it down his arm. Toward his palm. Nothing. He frowned and tried again, pushing harder this time. The stirring wasn't there. No gathering pressure from every part of his body. No subtle current threading through him. Just an emptiness inside. "What?" he muttered under his breath. A few minutes ago, the primordial heartwood rhizome had answered him instantly, forming clubs, spearing into Brahm's mouth, coming forth at his unconscious and conscious command. Now it felt dormant. Distant. Cade's stomach sank. He pulled up his status and glanced at his resources. His health was just over half, not great, but he'd been through worse. His stamina and mana though were both nearly empty. Less than 10% remained in each. That explained the tremor in his muscles. The creeping headache pressing against his skull. The faint weakness in his limbs. He hadn't truly felt it during the fight. Between the adrenaline and his hyper-focused meditation, he was focused on surviving the fight and not necessarily on the resources he was spending to keep up with the ash tortoise. But the cost had accumulated. He swallowed and tried once more, forcing his will against the rhizome. Grow. But nothing happened. The tendrils remained silent, dormant inside of his body. After several attempts, he sagged slightly, breath coming heavier. He couldn't make another weapon. Cade stared down at Brahm's unconscious form and tried to imagine what came next. He had nothing left. He couldn't make another weapon, which meant he had no clean way to finish the tortoise. Killing Brahm now would be slow and ugly. Just Cade, exhausted and empty, trying to beat an unconscious opponent to death with his bare hands. The thought sat wrong in his gut. Did he really need to kill him? The battle was over and Brahm wasn't moving. Pearl had said the tortoises were part of the cycle. That destruction fed creation. That without desolation, life would overrun everything and become monstrous. Brahm hadn't attacked the great tree out of random cruelty. He believed he was fulfilling some purpose greater than himself. Cade had stood at a choice like this once before. In the swamp, the system had offered him power for the life of something that could not fight back. A core in a rare class. All he had to do was crush an egg. It would have been the smart choice. The kind the system had clearly wanted him to make. But he hadn't done it then. Not because he was soft or naive. But because there was a difference between surviving a fight and killing something helpless. This felt too close to that line. Sure, Brahm had tried to kill him. Brahm would have killed him if he had won. But the fight was over now. The ash tortoise lay broken and unconscious at his feet. Killing him now would be an execution. A slow, bloody, and painful execution. And, if Cade were completely honest with himself, part of him enjoyed the fight. The realization unsettled him. He didn't want to become the kind of person who craved life and death struggles just to feel alive. And yet, when he examined it honestly, he understood why. It wasn't the violence that had thrilled him. It wasn't the thought of killing Brahm. It had been the exchange, the constant calculation, the reading of movement and intent, the split-second adjustments that turned certain defeat into narrow survival. Every feint, every counter, every opening found under pressure had felt like solving a living equation where the variables were muscle, timing, and will. The adrenaline, the razor-thin focus, the clarity of purpose in each heartbeat, it had stripped away doubt and noise until there was only the problem in front of him and his response to it. He hadn't enjoyed the idea of death. He had enjoyed rising to meet something overwhelming and not breaking. Finishing an unconscious opponent felt different. It wasn't a contest. There was no puzzle left to solve, no exchange of will and strength, just a defenseless body and a final, irreversible choice. Cade exhaled slowly, the last of the battle's tension draining from his shoulders. No, he said under his breath. He wouldn't execute him. Cade dismissed his status screen and deactivated hyper-focused meditation. The backlash hit instantly. Pain flooded his body in full force. Every impact he'd absorbed, every strained muscle, every micro-tear screamed for attention at once. His head throbbed violently, vision swimming for a moment as emotion rushed back in alongside sensation. He nearly doubled over but forced himself upright. So that's the downside, he thought grimly. Using his hyper-focused meditation skill in a real fight had consequences he now had to deal with. He turned away from Brahm, intent on leaving the destroyer behind. And froze mid-step. Several meters away stood another ash tortoise. But this one was enormous. Nearly 8 feet tall when fully upright. Broader, heavier, and obviously older than Brahm. Its shell wasn't the dull charcoal grey of Brahm's. It was pearlescent white. Light shimmered across its surface like polished marble catching the sun. The shell almost sparkled, faint iridescent hues dancing across its smooth, immaculate plates. It was beautiful and utterly terrifying at the same time. Cade tried to square his shoulders, tried to raise his guard, but exhaustion crashed over him in a heavy wave. His head pounded so hard his vision blurred at the edges. He exhaled slowly, attempting to steady himself. He didn't have much left in him, but he would fight as hard as he could to survive the new threat before him. The new addition to the hollow advanced without haste. Each step was deliberate. The pearlescent shell on his back caught the filtered light beneath the great tree and refracted it in faint iridescent hues, soft blues, pale pinks, ghostly silvers, beautiful in a way that felt profoundly wrong in a place now scoured by ash. Fine white particulates shifted around his feet but did not cling to him, as if even the remnants of desolation knew better than to settle on him. He was taller than Brahm by a full head, broader through the shoulders, his thick neck corded with dense, age-earned muscle. The plates of his shell were immaculate, smooth and uncracked, each segment layered seamlessly into the next. Where Brahm had raw power and barely restrained fury, this one radiated control. His ember-like eyes burned brighter, steadier. Not the feral, taunting blaze that had lived in Brahms. Cade stood where he was, chest still heaving, limbs trembling with fatigue. His broken shield lay in fragments beneath the unconscious Brahm. His clubs were ash. The rhizome inside him felt distant and hollow. The new ash tortoise's gaze passed briefly over Brahm's fallen form before settling fully on Cade. The ash around them drifted downward in soft, haunted silence as the tortoise closed the distance step by measured step. Cade swallowed. He had barely survived one destroyer. How could he survive another? His stamina and mana were nearly gone. His body ached. His head pounded from the backlash of hyper-focused meditation. If this one attacked now? He forced his shoulders back. He had come too far to die here. The tortoise approached until he stood only a few meters away. Close enough that Cade could see the faint, almost imperceptible glow beneath the pearlescent shell. Close enough that he could feel the weight of the creature's presence. Cade shifted his stance subtly, planting his feet shoulder-width apart. He raised his arms into a guarded posture despite the tremor running through them. Every muscle screamed in protest, but he forced his breathing to steady, projecting a readiness to fight that he wasn't sure he could back up. If he looked weak, the tortoise might strike. The silence between them stretched. Then, unexpectedly, the massive tortoise pressed his fists together before his chest and lowered his head in a formal bow. "Greetings, young one," he said, voice deep and resonant, carrying effortlessly through the hollow. Cade blinked. "I have borne witness to your victory over Brahm, prodigy of Ash." The tortoise lifted his head slowly, ember eyes calm and steady. "May I ask that you spare his life and allow me to bring him back to the tribe?" For a moment, Cade was certain he had misheard. He had braced for white flame. For a sudden charge. For another desperate battle he wasn't sure he could survive. Instead the newcomer had requested clemency for Brahm. Cade stared at the towering figure in front of him, mind racing to reconcile the words with the reality before him. The request had hit him harder than any of Brahm's punches. His mind, still half braced for another life or death exchange, struggled to adjust to the shift in tone. Spare his life? The tortoise seemed to take Cade's silence as permission to continue. He straightened fully, lowering his clasped fists but keeping his posture open. "I do not recognize your kind," he said evenly. "It has been many cycles since this realm was sealed. No new sapient species has walked beyond the ashen front in all that time." His ember-like eyes studied Cade with open curiosity rather than hostility. "I am Vorduhan," he continued, Duke of Desolation of the Ash Tortoises. "You may lower your guard, I am not here to fight. I have followed Brahm's trail for days. I am here only to retrieve him." He stepped back half a pace, granting Cade space. "And you are?" Cade didn't lower his guard. He let the silence stretch, searching for any hint of deception. The ash around them had nearly settled completely now. The hollow felt strangely calm, like the stillness after a wildfire had burned through a forest. Finally, he spoke. "Cade White Hollow," he said, voice steady despite the fatigue weighing on him. "I'm human. I ended up here by mistake." "Human," Vorduhan repeated, tasting the unfamiliar word. His gaze sharpened slightly, intrigued. "What an interesting development." He inclined his head faintly. "I would very much like to hear your story." "Maybe another time," Cade replied quickly. He wasn't eager to explain interdimensional accidents to an 8-foot-tall embodiment of desolation. Instead, he narrowed his eyes slightly. "If I let him go," Cade asked, nodding toward Brahm's unconscious form, "what happens next?" Vorduhan did not hesitate. "I return him to the tribe." His tone remained calm, but there was iron beneath it. "Brahm has disobeyed my directive. He ventured far beyond the ashen front without sanction. He allowed his ambition and arrogance to outrun wisdom." Vorduhan's gaze flicked briefly toward the fallen tortoise. "He must be reminded of his place within the cycle. Prodigy or not, he is not exempt from the laws that govern our realm." Cade studied him carefully. He didn't sense mockery. Didn't sense bloodlust waiting just beneath the surface. If anything, there was faint disappointment in the Duke's voice. Before Cade could respond, Vorduhan continued. "You would be welcome among us," he said evenly. "The Ash Tortoises respect strength. You have demonstrated considerable strength in defeating Brahm." His eyes drifted briefly around the ash-covered hollow. "And in surviving Brahm's vortex nearly untouched." Cade let out a short, incredulous breath. That's rich, he said. Coming from a destroyer. I thought your kind only respected killing and consuming. Isn't that your whole thing? Snuff out life, turn it to ash, move on. Vorduin did not bristle at the jab. If anything, he seemed amused. You have been speaking with the frogs, he observed. Cade didn't deny it. They saved me from dying in the Eye of Ash, he said flatly. And the only other tortoise I met there didn't exactly stick around for introductions. Vorduin's gaze grew more curious at that. Fascinating, he murmured. Cade hesitated for a moment before he stepped away from Brahm's unconscious body. You can take him, Cade said. As long as you promise you won't follow the frogs. Vorduin inclined his head once. The frogs are safe, he replied. Unless they stray too close to the ashen front, where our young earn their essence by culling their excessive growth. His gaze drifted briefly toward the distant horizon beyond the hollow away from the direction Pearl had fled. The ashen front remains several days' journey from here. Your orange companion will be unharmed so long as she returns directly to her Walker Lily village. Cade narrowed his eyes slightly. You seem to know a lot about the frogs, he said. Their village. The way they speak of you tortoises. Vorduin's deep chuckle rumbled through the hollow, low and unhurried. I have endured many cycles, the Duke replied. In youth, we measure ourselves by strength alone. By what we can burn. What we can break. His gaze drifted briefly over the ash-blanketed hollow. With age, that hunger tempers. Curiosity replaces fury. Observation and wisdom replaces base impulses. He looked back at Cade. I have watched the frogs for longer than you have been alive, human. Before Cade could press further, Vorduin stepped toward Brahm's motionless form. Cade tensed instinctively but did not interfere. The Duke lowered himself slowly, his movements controlled and deliberate. As he did, white ash began to stir around him, not violently like Brahm's vortex, but gently, almost reverently. Fine particulate lifted from the ground and drifted toward both tortoises. It condensed around Brahm's body, forming a faint, swirling mantle. Unlike the ashen vortex, this movement felt constructive rather than destructive. The ash did not scour the hollow, it gathered only around the fallen prodigy. Cade watched carefully. The ash settled into the cracks of Brahm's shell, along the seam Cade had fractured earlier and that Brahm had healed once before. It seeped into the tortoise's form as the fine powder was drawn into Brahm's channels. Vorduin closed his eyes briefly. The ash tightened, brightened faintly, then dispersed. Brahm's eyes snapped open. They darted wildly in confusion, then memory flooding back in an instant. His gaze locked onto Cade. Fury ignited. Brahm's claws flexed against the ash-covered ground, muscles tensing as if to surge forward. Calm yourself, Brahm, Vorduin said evenly. The authority in his voice was absolute. You have already lost. The words settled heavily between them. You are fortunate this human has chosen mercy. Take your defeat in stride. Learn from it. Brahm's jaw clenched. His ember-like eyes flickered between Cade and Vorduin. Rage warred visibly with barely controlled restraint. Now rise, Vorduin continued. We return to the ashen front. Brahm shut his eyes tightly for a brief moment, forcing his breathing to steady. When he opened them again, the fury remained but it was leashed. Slowly, heavily, he pushed himself upright. He did not look at Cade at first. But then, after a tense heartbeat, he stepped forward. To Cade's surprise, Brahm pressed his fists together before his chest and bowed his head. I acknowledge your strength, he said, voice tight, every syllable forced through restrained pride. And I am grateful for your mercy. The gratitude sounded strained and sour. It was clear he despised having to speak those words. Vorduin's gaze drifted downward toward the shattered fragments beneath Brahm's fall. The broken tortoise shell lay in dull pearlescent pieces across the ash. The Duke released a slow breath. The frogs will not be able to repair that, he said. Only our kind can restore an ash tortoise shell. He lifted his eyes back to Cade. You should come with us. Behind him, Brahm stiffened visibly but said nothing. Cade looked down at the fragments. For a moment, memories flickered, white flames splitting around its curve, lightning crashing against it, leeches splattering under its weight. Then he lifted his head and met Vorduin's gaze. That shell had saved my life more times than I would care to admit. But fighting Brahm has made me realize that I shouldn't rely on it. That shell is not mine and I shouldn't rely on borrowed protection. Vorduan's eyes glinted faintly with approval. A measured conclusion, he said. Power borrowed without comprehension breeds dependency. And dependency breeds weakness. Reliance on oneself is the true path to power. The faint approval in his tone faded as his focus sharpened. And what, the Duke asked evenly, do you plan to do about the unchecked growth taking root within you? Cade's eyes narrowed. How do you know about that? He asked carefully. Vorduan did not look surprised by the question. Every tortoise can sense life essence, he replied evenly. It is difficult not to when one's entire path is defined by its calling. His steady gaze rested on Cade's abdomen, as if he could see through flesh and bone. What grows within you is not small, Vorduan continued. It is young, potent and unstable. The primordial heartwood rhizome, Cade thought to himself. He could almost feel it again at the mention dormant but present, coiled somewhere deep inside him. It helped me survive, Cade said defensively. And it doesn't feel unstable. Not yet, Vorduan replied. The Duke stepped closer not threateningly, but with the quiet certainty of someone explaining a simple truth. Life that grows unchecked will always seek more, he said. More space to grow. More essence to fuel life's constant change. Without guidance, it does not stop. It expands until it consumes everything. Cade thought of the system's wording. Converts personal resources to produce living growth. He had already experienced the cost. Verosk will know how to deal with it, Cade said, though the words lacked conviction. Vorduan's deep chuckle returned. The frogs know how to nurture, he said. How to transform barren land into fertile soil. They can coax a single seed into a forest. His ember-like eyes gleamed faintly. But they do not prune. They let growth flourish, Vorduan continued. They celebrate it. Encourage it. But they do not master it. The Duke's gaze sharpened slightly. They will not help you control what is inside. They will only feed it until it consumes your entire being. Cade's jaw tightened. In his short time with the frogs, they had been kind but distant. They had tried to guide him along their paths only to conclude he had no affinity for them. If I went with you, Cade said slowly, how do I know you wouldn't just kill me and consume whatever's inside me? Brahm's eyes flicked up sharply at that but he stayed silent. Vorduan did not bristle. If I wished you dead, the Duke said calmly, you would not be standing here. There wasn't an ounce of arrogance in the statement, only cold hard truth. I offer you instruction, Vorduan continued. Stability to anchor and fortify your foundation. Clarity where you now walk in confusion. And, eventually, mastery over what stirs within you. His gaze held Cade's firmly. If you come with us to the Ashen Front and submit yourself to our teachings, I will personally guarantee your life. The words settled heavily in the quiet hollow. Behind Vorduan, Brahm watched with poorly concealed disbelief. Cade stood there in the ash, exhausted, aching, and drained of most of his strength. His eyes shifted toward the distant veil of mist where Pearl had disappeared, then back to the Duke standing patiently before him. Ash covered the hollow, settling over the scars of battle. He felt the faint, uneasy presence of the rhizome within his reforged body quiet now, but far from gone. The frogs offered known safety and familiarity but with them he had received uncertain guidance. The tortoises offered discipline and the potential to get rid of the parasite within him, but could he trust the destroyers to hold up to their word? Cade drew a slow breath, the weight of the choice pressing down on him. Kaylee White Hollow stood at the mountain's summit, letting the howling wind of Isis Peer Peak whip and tear at her long blonde hair. Her assistant had informed her that this was likely the coldest and windiest location in the entire quadrant. It was also, according to her assistant's running estimates, the area with the lowest undead density within the entire quadrant. Strategically optimal for maximum tutorial participant survival, it had said. Kaylee agreed but that didn't make the weather up here any more tolerable. The snow beneath her boots was hard-packed and wind-scoured, glittering beneath the pale morning sun. Below the summit on this side of the mountain, the ridge sloped into a dense evergreen forest so dark it seemed to swallow light whole. Beyond that, the frozen plains stretched outward in rolling white waves broken only by scattered pine clusters and the occasional jagged stone outcropping. Further still, at the very edge of their quadrant, rose the barrier. An opaque wall of shimmering energy that cut her quadrant off from the others that lay beyond. It reached from earth to sky, an unbroken curtain that hummed faintly if you stood close enough. From this height, she could trace its blue arc across the horizon. It had been 14 days since the tutorial began. 14 days of frozen death and blood. 14 days of skeletal hands clawing up through snow. Of zombies staggering from ancient burial pits in numbers that never seemed to thin. Her assistant had informed her early on that this was the most difficult starting quadrant. Reserved for high-potential candidates. Where the wheat could be separated from the chaff. Kaylee had smiled at that originally. She was always up for a challenge. Now she cursed her naivete. She stood tall against the wind, long blonde hair whipping behind her. Snowflakes caught in the strands before dissolving. Her black chainmail armor hugged her form from neck to wrist to ankle, practical and complete, none of the absurd gaps she'd seen in fantasy games her brother used to play growing up. The mail was layered over insulated padding, reinforced at the joints, built for war in the cold. A long sword rested at her hip. A shield of polished steel hung on her back. Behind her stood the settlement. It had started as little more than a ring of desperate survivors huddled against the wind. Now, wooden palisades reinforced with stone foundations ringed the flattened summit. Watchtowers rose at 4 points along the wall. Smoke curled from chimneys where fires burned constantly to stave off the cold. People moved inside hauling supplies, tending fires, sharpening weapons. Her people. Kaylee had founded this settlement on the third day. If they were going to survive the frozen hellscape the system had thrown them into, they would do it under structure. Under leadership. Under her leadership. Not everyone had agreed at first. Some wanted to hide in caves. Some wanted to run down the mountain and throw themselves uselessly at the undead. Others wanted to resist her command. Those dissidents were quickly eliminated. The undead didn't tire. They didn't fear the cold. They didn't stop. Kaylee had learned quickly that adaptation wasn't optional. The faster she embraced this new world, the higher she would rise within it. The view from the peak was almost serene enough to forget that beneath the snow lay mass graves. Most of the undead crawled from shallow pits, thousands of frozen bodies thrown together in rotting heaps. Those gave rise to the basic units. Skeletons with rusted blades. Zombies in torn armor. Tireless foot soldiers in a mindless army. The mausoleums were worse. Ancient stone structures half buried in frost, their doors cracked open from within. The undead that emerged from those were stronger, more coordinated, and better equipped. And somewhere deep within Isispear Peak itself lay the crypt that housed the general of these accursed undead. Kaylee intended to clear the entire quadrant before the walls came down on day 31. Boots pounded through the snow behind her. She didn't turn immediately. She already knew the rhythm of the one that approached. The scout skidded to a halt a few steps behind her, breath heaving. "They're moving," he said. Another wave closing in on the forest's edge. Kaylee nodded once. "How many?" "Hard to say. Looks similar to yesterday's second surge." "Alert the inner watch," she said calmly. "Keep everyone inside the walls." The scout hesitated. "Should we rally the forward team?" Kaylee shook her head. "No. My father and I will handle this one." The scout's shoulders straightened immediately. "Yes, Paragon." He turned and ran back toward the gates. Kaylee rested one hand on the hilt of her sword and stared into the dark forest below. Within minutes, the first shapes began to emerge between the trees. The first skeleton cleared the treeline in a jerking sprint. Kaylee moved. Her boots barely sank into the snow as she descended the slope, shield sliding into her left hand in one smooth motion. The wind cut across her face, sharp and clean, but she welcomed it. It kept her awake and focused on the task in front of her. The skeleton raised a rusted blade. Kaylee's sword flashed once. Steel sang as the skeleton split from shoulder to hip, bones scattering across the snow in a loose spray. She didn't pause to watch it fall. More poured from the forest, zombies with frost-stiffened limbs, skeletons in fragments of ancient armor, jaws snapping uselessly as they charged. They were level 12. Level 14. One particularly bulky specimen was level 16. They were but blades of grass to a lawnmower. Kaylee flowed into them. Her glowing white longsword carved a bright arc through the morning air, shearing through ribs, femurs, and vertebrae with effortless grace. A zombie lunged, she pivoted, smashed its jaw from its skull with her shield, and drove the sword up through the soft palate. The steel punched through frozen brain matter and tore out the back of its head. She withdrew, turned, and cut again. A skeleton tried to flank her. She stepped into it, inside its guard, and cleaved through its spine. Bones burst apart like brittle glass. The snow around her became littered with shattered remains. She did not overextend. She did not rush. She moved like a dancer across the battlefield, every motion measured, fluid, and so effortless it seemed the dead were simply collapsing around her. A zombie swung wildly. She ducked beneath it, sliced through both hamstrings, and finished it with a downward stab through the sternum. Her breathing stayed even. Behind her. Boom. The sound rolled across the mountainside like distant thunder. An undead torso disintegrated mid-charge, chest cavity erupting as a fist-sized rock tore through it. Kaylee didn't need to look to know. Her father, Henry Whitehollow, stood 30 meters back, boots planted wide in the snow. He was a large man, broad shoulders, thick arms, braided strawberry blonde beard swinging with each movement. His long hair was tied back to keep it from his eyes. The makeshift blunderbuss in his hands belched smoke as he reloaded with efficient, practiced motions. When he selected the Beast Tamer class, he hadn't expected to be dropped into a frozen wasteland devoid of any beasts worth taming. The system had a cruel sense of humor, but he made do with what he had. Henry had adapted nearly as well as Kaylee. If he couldn't command beasts, he would become the artillery. Another skeleton slipped past Kaylee's blade. Boom! It exploded into fragments before it took another step. She allowed herself the faintest smile as she cut through the front ranks, dancing between grasping hands and snapping jaws. Henry fired with careful timing, each blast obliterating anything that managed to slip past her. She spun, blade flashing in tight arcs. A trio of skeletons fell in rapid succession. A zombie lunged, she stepped aside and severed its head in one clean strike. Her system notifications flickered constantly at the edge of her vision. You have defeated Shambling Skeleton level 15. You have defeated Frozen Grave Walker level 17. You have defeated Rhymebound Corpse level 21. She ignored them just like most of the others, preferring to keep her attention on the undead even as their numbers thinned. The forest edge grew quiet. Only a few stragglers stumbled forward now. Kaylee slowed her advance, boots crunching across a carpet of shattered bone and frozen flesh. For a moment, she thought that was it. Then she saw it. 10 meters inside the treeline. A skull. Hollow eye sockets burned with twin blue flames, their glow sharp with a calculating awareness the other undead utterly lacked. She had seen that skull many times before. It always kept its distance. Always watching just out of reach as she slaughtered its mindless minions. Whenever she pushed too far into the forest, the blue flames would retreat, slipping back into shadow before she could close the distance. An elite smart enough to avoid her blade. The flames flared as it met her gaze. A week ago, she would have let it go. But today was the day she would finally extinguish those flames. Kaylee stepped forward and raised her sword. The creature paused. She could feel the weight of her new power coiled within her core. Level 25 had not come without its perks. She pointed her blade directly at the skull. Judgment of the Vanguard, she whispered. Both mana and stamina flooded her channels as light detonated from her sword. A beam 3 meters wide tore across the snow in a blinding ray of incandescent brilliance. It stretched 50 meters into the forest, vaporizing everything in its path. Skeletons caught in the beam disintegrated instantly. Zombies ignited and burned to black ash in less than a heartbeat. Trees exploded into steam and flame. The blue-flamed skull had just enough time to flare in shock before it was snuffed out of existence as the beam carved a glowing trench through snow and earth. The light faded and silence followed. Ding! You have defeated Kirintal, Lich Captain of the Grave level 27. You have gained additional experience for killing a creature above your level. Tutorial quest updated, Cull the Undead. Progress. Captain slain, 3 of 8. General slain, 0 of 1. Kaylee dismissed the notifications and lowered her blade slowly. Steam rose from the molten scar she had left behind. Behind her, Henry let out a low whistle. Well, he called out, smoke curling out of the end of his blunderbuss, that's new. Without Kirintal's presence at the treeline, the remaining undead lost what little cohesion they'd possessed. They staggered forward in ones and twos, easy prey. Kaylee cut them down methodically, careful not to advance too close to the forest's shadow. Even with the captain defeated, she wasn't reckless. When the final skeleton collapsed into scattered bone, she stood still for a moment, scanning the dark edge for any sign of renewed movement. Nothing. Her new ability still hummed faintly in her veins, though she could already feel the cooldown settling in. It would be a while before she could call upon it again. Boots crunched behind her. That was one hell of a trick, Henry said, walking up beside her, blunderbuss resting across his shoulder. Kaylee allowed herself a small smile. That was the skill I chose after reaching level 25. He raised a brow. That a fact? Thought I'd test it properly. She glanced at the scorched path. Shame about the cooldown. I'd like to practice it a few more times. Henry barked a laugh. You're gonna run out of forest if you keep that up. She sheathed her sword and turned back toward the settlement. As they approached the gates, the watchmen were already cheering. The gates opened, and a swell of voices met them. Kaylee, you're amazing. Did you see that light? That beam went halfway into the forest. People crowded near the entrance, bundled in patchwork armor. Some held spears. Others clutched tools they were slowly learning to use. Their breath fogged in excited bursts as they spoke over one another. You saved us again, Paragon. We're lucky you're here. Them bonies don't stand a chance with you leading us. Kaylee inclined her head politely, offering brief smiles and a few reassuring words. Keep reinforcing the southern wall, she told one group. Rotate the watch every 2 hours. And make sure people stay indoors when the sun dips. They nodded fervently. She kept her expression carefully tempered, but beneath that restraint, warmth spread through her chest. They looked at her like she was their salvation, and she savored every ounce of their praise. Henry clapped a few men on the shoulder as they passed, offering gruff encouragement, but he let her walk slightly ahead. The deference was subtle, but intentional. They reached the largest structure in the settlement, a reinforced building of stone and timber that served as their point of command. Inside, a cluster of scouts and officers waited around a wide table. A crude but functional map of the quadrant lay stretched across it. Carved stone markers represented human patrols. Smaller, darker pieces marked known undead activity. Scout Commander Callahan stood at the head of the table. He was lean, sharp-eyed, with grey clinging to the edges of his beard. He straightened when Kaylee entered. Report, she said, stepping forward. Callahan nodded. We located another burial pit along the eastern plains. Standard mass grave configuration. Skeletons and zombies spawning at consistent intervals. A stone marker was placed near the quadrant's border. When the scouts approached, they received a tutorial quest, he continued. Clear the pit by defeating the Bone Lieutenant. Kaylee's eyes flicked to the location. Distance. 2 days' travel if the weather holds. Do we need to lead the assault? Callahan shook his head. No, Paragon. We have a team nearing level 20. With preparation, they should be capable of eliminating the lieutenant. She nodded once. Good. Let them take it out and gain the benefits from the tutorial quest. I want daily updates. Callahan shifted to the next marker. We also discovered a mausoleum. Kaylee's jaw tightened slightly. The mausoleums produced stronger undead. Coordinated units with pristine equipment. Sometimes even commanders like the Lich Captain she just eliminated. Where? She asked. He pointed to a position southwest of the mountain's base. But there's something strange, Callahan added. There were no active undead surrounding it. Her brows drew together. Explain. The ground outside was littered with shattered bones, he said. Our scouts entered the structure and found the same inside. Her gaze sharpened. And they found a stone sarcophagus in the central chamber. He paused. It had been blown apart from the inside. A flicker of unease moved through her. None of the bones were animated, she asked. None. Then either something strong is roaming free, she murmured, or there are more survivors we haven't found yet. I'll look into it. Callahan inclined his head. That brings me to the final report. Her attention snapped back to him. We've located additional survivors, he said. Small group. They've already been brought into quarantine. For a split second, Kaylee's controlled expression cracked. Her eyes lit up. Survivors, she repeated. Yes, Paragon. She shot him a look. You should have led with that. Callahan opened his mouth to respond, but she was already moving out the door toward quarantine. Behind her, Callahan sighed under his breath. And that, he said wryly, is exactly why I didn't open with it. The quarantine enclosure sat along the outer ring of the settlement, sectioned off by a secondary wooden barrier reinforced with crude iron brackets. A fire burned constantly at its entrance. No one entered the main camp without first being observed for signs of infection, bite wounds, necrotic discoloration, erratic behavior. Kaylee strode toward it without slowing. The guard at the entrance snapped to attention the moment he saw her. Paragon. Report, she said. The man Derek, if she remembered correctly, shifted slightly. 7 new arrivals. 3 men, 4 women. Malnourished but stable. Minor frostbite. No visible undead contamination. She stepped closer. Any of them fighting types? A couple look like they've seen combat. But, he hesitated. But, she pressed. I don't think any of them are who you're looking for. Her jaw tightened faintly. He might not be using his real name, she said. Let me through. There wasn't even a flicker of resistance. Of course, Paragon. The gate opened immediately and Kaylee stepped inside. The survivors huddled near the central fire pit, wrapped in spare blankets. Their faces were hollowed by exhaustion. Fear lingered in their eyes, even here. They looked up when she entered. She scanned them carefully. Too thin. Too short. Wrong eyes. One man started to rise, as if recognizing her from the whispers already spreading through their group. She cut him off gently. Rest. She walked the perimeter, but he wasn't here. None of them were the man she was looking for. A quiet disappointment settled in her chest, but she didn't let it show. Ensure they're fed, she told Derek as she exited. Keep them here for observation through tomorrow. Yes, Paragon. The gate shut behind her. The wind tugged at her hair again as she stepped away from the enclosure. A single tear threatened to roll down her cheek. He was here. Somewhere. And when she found Cade, she would make sure he survived. Take a step back. The Duke of Desolation did not raise his voice, yet the words carried the weight of his authority. Cade hesitated only a fraction of a second before he stepped away from the shattered remains of his old shell scattered across the ashen ground. Vorduin moved forward. The ancient tortoise lowered his massive head and inhaled a slow, deliberate breath. And as he inhaled, the broken shell fragments trembled. Cade's eyes widened as the pieces cracked further, dissolving into fine grey particles that lifted from the ground in delicate streams, spiraling through the air like smoke caught in a gentle current. The cloud that was once Cade's shell drifted toward Vorduin and settled against his own immense shell. As the particles sank in, his own brilliant pearlescent shell dulled ever so slightly. The ground where his old shell had been was left bare. Cade swallowed. What did you just do? Vorduin exhaled softly, a plume of warm air stirring the ash at their feet. An ancestor's shell does not belong on this soil, he said. I will return it to its proper place in time. There was reverence in his voice. Cade stared at the Duke's shell, mind racing. Between that display and everything he'd witnessed during the fight with Brahm the Vortex, the white flames, the control over ash, it was becoming harder to dismiss the tortoises as mindless destroyers. Maybe they did understand what was happening inside him. Maybe they could do something about the rhizome. It's not like the frogs taught you anything, he thought grimly. Esmeralda had dangled knowledge like bait but offered nothing concrete. If the Duke was offering answers, wasn't that worth the risk? How would I even come with you? Cade asked. The ashen front doesn't exactly sound hospitable to humans. Vorduin's ancient eyes regarded him with faint amusement. You survived Brahm's ashen vortex, he said. You endured what would have reduced most living beings in this realm to drifting residue. I suspect you will manage. That wasn't exactly reassuring, but the old tortoise did have a point. And what of the great tree? Cade asked. If I go with you, won't the ashen front just come through and burn it down? I can't let you do that. Vorduin let out a low, rumbling chuckle. Many tortoises have tried, he said. The outer bark may be scorched. The youngest roots can be burned. But the deeper structure, he shook his massive head slightly. It endures. Cade frowned. The tree resists even the purest flames, Vorduin continued. When the ashen front advances through its territory, it withdraws. Its essence recedes inward. It becomes dormant and is not worth the essence it would take to consume. Cade's brow furrowed further. So you're saying it just waits you out? Yes. It has done so for as many cycles as I can remember. We burn what we can. We consume what is exposed. But the great tree persists. His gaze remained fixed on Cade. None have yet reduced it to ash. Cade's eyes narrowed slightly as he processed that. Without further ceremony, Vorduin turned toward the maze of the great tree trials. White flame bloomed along the edges of his jaws. He exhaled and the living wood wall crumbled before the precise flame. Cade lingered only a heartbeat longer, then exhaled and made his choice. Whatever waited at the ashen front answers or ruin was more than he would find standing here alone. He fell into step behind the Duke without another word. They walked through corridors of smoldering roots and curling smoke, the Duke leading with unheard steps. After a time, Vorduhan spoke again. "Tell me your story." Cade stiffened. "How a human came to walk this realm," the Duke continued mildly. "I am curious." Cade's pulse quickened. Telling his life story to a creature who could make Brahm bow in deference didn't exactly feel safe. He walked in silence, weighing his options. Vorduhan glanced back at him. "A simple exchange," he said. "If you give me no lies, you will receive no lies. Offer half-truths, and I shall answer in kind." The Duke's gaze sharpened slightly. "I value knowledge. Share yours, and I will share mine." It reminded Cade uncomfortably of Second Elder Verosk and the Golden Toad's quiet, knowing stare. He took a slow breath. "That's really what you want? In exchange for teaching me how to control whatever it is inside of me?" Cade asked. "It is." "Fine," he said. "Then I'll tell you everything. My world was normal," he began. "Well, non-magical is probably a better word. No cores or system or mana. No talking frogs or tortoises." Vorduhan hummed thoughtfully. "How dreary." Cade huffed a quiet laugh. "Yeah, it kind of was. The science and technology we had were impressive, I'll give it that, but day-to-day life? Pretty dull, honestly." He kept his eyes forward as they passed through another corridor in the maze. "I was about to lose my job when it happened. The system came. Just sort of appeared out of the blue. As far as I know, it took everyone on Earth and evaluated us." "Evaluated," the Duke repeated, as though tasting the word. "It classified people, separated us into normies or someone more worthwhile. The worthwhile ones got system cores." Vorduhan's heavy steps slowed slightly. "Cores are forged," he said. "They are the crystallization of will, essence, and refinement. How does this system gift them to your people?" Cade shrugged. "I don't know. I didn't get one." The Duke's gaze shifted to him briefly, but he did not say anything further. "I was labeled a normie," Cade went on. "But something went wrong. Instead of sending me to a normie tutorial, it shoved me into one meant for people with classes and cores. And you had neither. Right." They stepped out of the last smoldering corridor and into open terrain beyond the maze, ash drifting in lazy currents behind them. "The tutorial, at least the part I was in, was a swamp," Cade said. "A giant, miserable swamp. And I wasn't alone. I was stuck with my old lab mates. And my boss. The same boss who'd fired me less than an hour before the system showed up." Vorduhan made a soft, amused sound. "Fate has a sense of humor. They all had classes. Well, the professor had a profession, but they seem like the same thing to me. They all had cores." Cade's jaw tightened slightly. "I tried to keep up. But without a core, I couldn't grow the way they did. Every fight caused them to pull further ahead." He paused. "After a day, we ran into another group and merged. Strength in numbers, right?" He gave a humorless smile. "I've never felt more unnecessary in my life. I stuck out like a sore thumb. Even my smallest contribution meant nothing to them." Vorduhan said nothing, but Cade didn't feel like his silence was dismissive. "One night, I was on watch with Saish, one of my lab mates. We got into an argument." Cade flexed his fingers unconsciously. "About my usefulness. About whether I was holding everyone back." The memory still burned clear in his mind. "So I left," he said simply. "I told myself it was strategic. That I didn't want to be a burden. That I didn't want them wasting resources protecting someone the system had already rejected." He let out a slow breath. "If I'm being honest, I was embarrassed. They had cores. I didn't. I was tired of being the one everyone had to watch over. Tired of being the one that was dragging down the group." Vorduhan's ancient eyes narrowed faintly. Cade continued. "After that, I somehow survived on my own." He hesitated, then added, "I killed 2 lords of the swamp." The words hung in the air between them. "I got lucky," Cade said quickly. "The first one underestimated me and I was in the right place at the right time for the second." He glanced sideways, trying to read the Duke's reaction. Vorduhan's expression remained placid. Unbothered, as if Cade just told him 2 + 2 = 4. When he noticed Cade looking, the Duke spoke. Death is a natural consequence of life, he said calmly. My kind culls the excess the frogs produce. We consume the essence and refine it. Cade's brow furrowed. What exactly is essence? The frogs kept bringing it up, but the system never mentioned anything about it. Vorduin's gaze drifted back to the path ahead. Essence is the foundation of all things in this realm, he said evenly. When properly claimed, it tempers the body and aids in the shaping and refinement of one's core. We harness it to strengthen ourselves so that, one day, we may burn away the knot that binds this realm. Cade's steps faltered for half a heartbeat, but Vorduin did not slow. You will learn in time, he said mildly. For now, continue with your story. Cade frowned but let it go. If the Duke was serious about trading truth for truth, he would circle back eventually. After I killed the Second Lord, Cade continued, I found an egg. He could still picture it pulsing faintly underneath the Burrow Warden's den. The system told me to destroy it. Said whatever hatched from that egg would grow into something that could threaten humanity inside the tutorial. Vorduin's eyes flicked toward him. And I take it you did not. No, Cade shook his head. I couldn't. It hadn't done anything yet. Killing it felt wrong. He glanced down at his hands as they walked. When it hatched, the system gave me a new quest. I was supposed to guide the hatchling to its ancestral training grounds. He hesitated. The Duke had said no half-truths. The hatchling was a small alligator, Cade said. Its name was Acalion. At the mention of his name, both Vorduin and Brahm stopped in their tracks. Ash swirled lazily around their massive forms as they turned to look at him fully. Acalion, the Duke repeated, and for the first time since Cade had met him, genuine interest sharpened his voice. Yes. Where is he? Brahm demanded, unable to keep the edge from his tone. I don't know, Cade said quickly. Vorduin held his gaze for a moment longer, then inclined his head slightly. Continue. Cade exhaled slowly. Acalion led me through the swamp. He was stronger than he looked. Kept most of the beasts in the swamp away from us with just his aura. A faint smile tugged at Cade's mouth before fading. Eventually we reached a ritual circle. He performed some kind of magic, then there was a beam of violet light. He paused but again remembered the Duke's warning about half-truths. When we entered the beam, Cade added, the system told me I was entering a corrupted dungeon. It said system access would be limited inside. Vorduin's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. And during the transport, Cade searched for words. We were in a weird void space and then a giant violet eye appeared. Brahm shifted uncomfortably. It separated us, Cade finished. Acalion and I were torn away from each other before we arrived. The next thing I knew, I was lying in what I now know as the Ashen Wastes. At the mention of it, Brahm gulped audibly. Vorduin's gaze rested on Cade with a knowing glint. I was alone, Cade continued. Ash dunes everywhere around and a storm rolling in from the horizon. I saw a massive worm fleeing the storm only for the storm to catch it not long after I arrived. His throat tightened slightly at the memory. And then I saw him, the Ashen Emperor. Even speaking the title felt heavy. He brought the worm down and erased it with white fire, Cade said, gesturing faintly between them. Like the flames you and Brahm used, just greater. No offense. The Emperor's fire felt final. Like there was nothing left once it touched the worm's corpse. You were fortunate, Vorduin said quietly. Creatures that cross paths with the Ashen Emperor rarely survive. Even his kin must be careful around him. Yet, Cade muttered. I kind of figured that out later. He let out a slow breath. I somehow found a discarded tortoise shell and hid under it while the storm and the Emperor passed. When the Emperor gathered the ash from the worm, some of that ash fell onto me. Brahm's head angled subtly, but the slight movement couldn't hide the flash of envy that sparked in his eyes at Cade's words. Cade's jaw tightened. It burned. Stripped me of everything. My gear. My clothes. Even the 2 Lord cores I'd taken. Vorduin stopped walking. Ah, he said softly. Then louder, with unmistakable satisfaction, I knew it. He turned toward Brahm. That is how he survived your Ashen Vortex. Brahm stiffened. Cade blinked. Wait, what? What do you mean that's how I survived? Cade asked. Vorduin studied him as if he were a puzzle finally snapping into place. What you experienced, the Duke said, was an Ashen baptism. Cade blinked. Yet. The system told me that much. Vorduin inclined his head. Not merely an ashen baptism. One delivered by the Ashen Emperor himself using the purest ash in this realm. Brahm's eyes widened at the Duke's words. Cade frowned. All I know is that it burned me nearly to death. Stripped every piece of equipment I had. Reduced me to skin and bone and black sludge. A faint, knowing smile tugged at the corner of the Duke's mouth. The ashen baptism is a sacred rite, he calmly explained. Every tortoise undergoes it. It scours the body clean, forcing weakness and impurities out through whatever path they can escape. What you called sludge is nothing more than the remnants of those expelled impurities. The ash refines what survives and prepares the body for what lies ahead. He continued walking, voice calm and measured. For one who walks the path of ash properly, the number of impurities is small. Our fire refines us as we grow. Your body expelled what did not belong. That black effluent you describe was waste, nothing more. Cade thought back to the stench. The weakness in his body afterward. The way he'd felt hollowed out. He couldn't help the stray thought that surfaced. I didn't exactly live clean before all this. Late nights in grad school. Dinner from the vending machine outside the lab. Energy drinks instead of sleep. Years of stress layered over poor habits. Vorduin's voice cut through his thoughts. What happened after the baptism? Cade was dragged out of his thoughts and drew in a breath. When I woke up, everything was different. The dunes were gone. No more rolling ash hills. Just flat, compacted ground. A completely desolate land. They crested a low ridge as he continued. I walked away from the ash storm. After a while, the air started getting misty. Then I heard thunder. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth despite himself. I tried hiding under the shell again at first. But when lightning struck it, he hesitated, searching for the right words. I can't really explain it, but after the lightning struck, something in me didn't want to hide anymore. It was like my body craved that lightning. Brahm shifted, clearly preparing to comment, but Vorduin gave him a look and the younger tortoise fell silent. I climbed on top of the shell, Cade continued. And let the lightning hit me. Brahm's head snapped toward him, eyes wide in disbelief. It felt he struggled for words. Right. Like my body was drinking it in. He flexed his fingers as if remembering the current in his veins. Until the violet lightning came. His expression darkened. That one didn't mesh as well as the others. Vorduin's eyes sharpened slightly, but he did not interrupt. I survived, Cade continued. Barely. That's when Pearl found me. The orange frog that was with me when Brahm attacked. Brahm's jaw tightened, but he remained quiet. She brought me to her village, Cade said. I met Second Elder Verosk, but we couldn't understand each other, so Pearl forced me to eat Verosk's golden mucus. For the first time since this conversation began, Vorduin let out a deep, rumbling laugh. That old toad still insists upon that particular delicacy. Yeah, Cade muttered. Said it would help me. And did it? Cade hesitated. It did something, he admitted. I had a crazy vision. Felt like I'd taken drugs or something. Vorduin's amusement vanished in an instant and he came to a complete stop. The genial warmth that had colored his presence thinned, sharpening into focused intent. The ancient tortoise turned fully toward Cade, his gaze heavy and unblinking. Tell me. What exactly did you see in this vision? Vorduin's face filled Cade's vision. The Duke of Desolation had closed the distance between them in an instant, and now the massive tortoise's ember-lit eyes were only inches from his own. Cade instinctively leaned back a fraction, feet squelching in the wet ground beneath him. Cade cleared his throat. In the vision, I was in the body of a black frog. Vorduin didn't move. Cade swallowed and continued. She was traveling through a field of desolate ash. It looked like nothing had grown there for a long time. Vorduin's eyes sharpened. Continue. Cade nodded, uneasily aware of how interested the Duke suddenly was. Time felt wrong inside the vision. At some points it was like days passed in seconds. Then other moments stretched on for far longer than they should have. Cade rubbed at the back of his neck. I didn't realize it at the time, he said, thinking aloud as much as speaking to them, but the frog in the vision was showing me all three of the frog paths. Brahm's head tilted slightly. Cade went on. She brought mist and rain over the ash. Then she called down lightning to strike the ground. And after that, she grew things. A whole swampy forest out of nothing but dead ash in her breath. Trees and vines sprouted like the land had been waiting for her to tell it to wake up. His voice slowed. And then she grew something even bigger. Vorduin made a low sound in his throat, urging him onward. A giant tree, Cade said. Bigger than anything I'd ever seen. At the time I didn't really think about it, but, he trailed off, glancing around the jungle canopy. It looked a lot like the great tree. He fell silent for a moment, hearing the conclusion form in his own head as he said it aloud. Vorduin was the one who finally spoke. It is likely, the Duke said, that you witnessed a vision of Sil. Cade blinked. Sil. The ancestor of the frogs of this realm. The one who cut this realm off from the multiverse many cycles ago. If that's true, Cade said slowly, then the giant tree I saw, he looked at Vorduin. That was the great tree, wasn't it? Vorduin gave a small, considering nod. It is likely the same tree, yes. But the tree itself is a trivial matter compared to the vision. Cade frowned. How is a giant tree trivial? What matters, Vorduin said, is that you were able to witness Sil at all. That you could walk along her in her skin. Cade stared at the Duke. How is that even possible? I mean Verosk fed me his mucus so I could understand the frogs. How does that turn into some kind of ancestral memory? I am not certain, Vorduin admitted. But Verosk's mucus is not meant to grant revelation. It is meant to aid communication, to translate emotion, intent, and meaning into something the one who consumes it can understand. Cade opened his mouth to press further, but Vorduin moved on first. Continue your story, the Duke said. How did you come from that vision to standing here? Cade let out a slow breath and kept walking. After the vision ended, I came back to reality and the frogs offered to teach me their ways. He stepped over a fallen trunk slick with moss and rot. I accepted because I figured they knew more about this dungeon than I did, which wasn't exactly saying much. Brahm let out a short snort. Cade half smiled despite himself. But, he hesitated, then shrugged. Esmeralda wasn't exactly the best teacher. Vorduin chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. Despite appearances, he said, the frogs are creatures of instinct. They do not truly teach their young. It is more accurate to say they lead them down the paths of their ancestor rather than instruct them directly. That was an incredibly accurate description of the frog's method of teaching, Cade thought. They continued deeper through the swampy jungle. Thick roots twisted across the ground like coiled serpents while enormous leaves brushed Cade's shoulders as they passed. But the strangest part was the silence. Cade had grown used to the swamp being alive with noise, buzzing insects, distant splashes, rustling brush. Now there was almost nothing. Just the slow squelch of their steps. He noticed something darting through the undergrowth ahead. A small scaled creature froze the moment it spotted them. Then it bolted in the opposite direction. Has anything attacked you guys on the way back before? He asked. Vorduin's gaze shifted slightly toward him. Occasionally yes, but it is quite rare. I mean, Cade gestured vaguely around them. We're walking through the middle of the swamp and nothing's even trying to get close. No leeches. No beasts. Nothing. Vorduin gave a low hum of understanding. Most creatures born from the frog's creation recognize a destroyer, the Duke said. Their instincts guide them away. Because? Cade prompted. Because their lives would end, Vorduin replied simply. And their essence would be consumed. Cade grimaced slightly. That seems a bit harsh. It is truth. While there are some creatures that will challenge us, they are rarely seen before they attack. They stepped over a stretch of shallow water where thick reeds grew in dense clusters. The plants leaned away from the tortoises as if recoiling from some invisible heat. Unless a creature is particularly foolish, Vorduin continued, I doubt we will encounter any living animals on our way back to the Ashen Front. He paused briefly before adding. Excluding plant life, of course. Brahm huffed quietly behind them. Vorduin glanced back at Cade. Now continue your story. What happened next? Cade sighed. Well, after a few attempts it became pretty obvious that I wasn't exactly cut out for their way of doing things. He rubbed the back of his neck again. Esmeralda let me use a few relics tied to their ancestor to try and help me learn. Brahm tilted his head slightly. Cade continued, one of them had something to do with lightning. I thought the whole point was to resonate with the lightning, but I ended up taking it into myself instead. He winced slightly at the memory. Vorduin's eyes flickered with amusement. And you nearly destroyed the relic, the Duke guessed. Yeah, Cade admitted. Pretty much. Brahm let out a short bark of laughter. The frogs must have been furious. They weren't thrilled, Cade said. From that, Verosk decided they couldn't teach me their ways. Vorduin gave a small nod. A reasonable conclusion. Cade continued walking, stepping around a patch of glowing blue mushrooms that pulsed faintly beneath a fallen log. After that, Verosk told me to go with Pearl to the Great Tree. Said I should take the Great Tree trials with her. The old toad showed wisdom, Vorduin said. For a toad. Cade smirked faintly. He figured the Great Tree might have some kind of answer for me. So you went? Yeah. Cade pushed aside a hanging vine as they passed beneath a massive swamp fig tree. We didn't exactly have a smooth trip getting there. Pearl and I got chased by a giant leech. We ran to the maze around the Great Tree and got separated. Brahm suddenly interrupted Cade. Why did you run? Cade blinked and looked back at him. What? Why did you flee from the leech? Brahm repeated. You should have been more than capable of killing it. Cade snorted. I am now, he said. Back then? Not even close. Brahm frowned. Cade shrugged. The Ashen baptism stripped a lot out of me. It left me weak as hell for a while. I couldn't even think straight most of the time. The large tortoise studied him. Then how did you become strong enough to defeat me in single combat? Cade raised a finger. I'm getting there. He stepped over a shallow pool where strange floating flowers glowed faintly beneath the water's surface. After Pearl and I got separated, I kept moving through the maze and eventually made it inside the Great Tree itself. Vorduin's eyes narrowed slightly with interest. And there, Cade continued, I found something called the Storm Sap Crucible. Brahm leaned forward slightly as he walked. And what is that? Cade scratched the side of his jaw. Basically a wooden lightning bolt that transformed the tree's sap into lightning. That earned a rare pause from both tortoises. I used it to, well, reforge my body. Silence followed them for several steps. Finally, Vorduin spoke. The Duke's tone carried genuine curiosity. You began tempering your body through the method of the ash tortoises, he said slowly. But you completed the process using the essence of the Great Tree. He shook his head slightly. How interesting. I have never heard of a creature doing such a thing. Cade gave an awkward shrug. I didn't really know what I was doing, he admitted. I was mostly just following my instincts. Listening to what my body needed. He glanced toward the distant canopy. I guess the frogs rubbed off on me a bit. Cade fell quiet after that. The three of them continued forward through the swampy jungle in steady silence. The ground was uneven, thick roots rising like knotted veins through the mud. Massive trees towered overhead, their trunks wrapped in curtains of moss and hanging vines. Pools of stagnant water reflected pale light through the canopy. Despite the life everywhere around them, nothing moved near their path. Cade walked between the two tortoises, bare feet sinking slightly into the damp earth with each step. His mind churned. There was still one part of the story he hadn't told. The corruption and the quest to cleanse this dungeon. But he had already promised them the truth. And so far he had given it. They walked in silence for several more minutes before Vorduin's voice broke the stillness. Is that the entirety of your story? Cade shook his head and sighed quietly. Might as well go all the way. No, he said. There's a bit more. His tone grew more serious. When I woke up in this realm, I received a quest from the system. That got both tortoises' attention immediately. A quest? Brahm rumbled. Cade nodded. It's called Cleanse Cynthia's Legacy. It didn't actually update until after I killed some leeches in the swamp, he explained. When I killed them, the quest updated and told me I had made progress toward cleansing the corruption. Vorduin opened his mouth to speak. Cade lifted a hand. Let me finish, he said. The Duke closed his mouth again and inclined his head. When I was reforging my body in the Storm Sap Crucible, I discovered something strange at the base of it. His brow furrowed slightly at the memory. The lightning in the crucible was normal. At least normal for this realm. It felt balanced with everything around it. But there was something else. Something wrong that didn't harmonize with the multicolored lightning the Storm Sap Crucible had produced. Brahm's eyes narrowed. What form did it take? Violet lightning, Cade said. It didn't feel like the rest of the crucible's energy. It felt twisted. Like it didn't belong there. He looked toward Vorduin. It was corrupting the base of the Storm Sap Crucible. I don't know how long it had been there, but it definitely wasn't supposed to be. And what did you do? Vorduin asked. I burned the corruption out. Cade flexed his fingers unconsciously, remembering the clash within himself, the violet dragon thrashing against his will as it tried to take him over. I drew it into myself and used my own body to refine its energy before forcing it back into the crucible, with the intent that it would destroy the corruption. It was difficult, but eventually it worked. After that, the corruption was cleansed but the crucible no longer worked. Cade hesitated for a moment, then added. When the corruption burned out, Cade continued, the system notified me that I'd formed something called a law seed. Brahm stopped in his tracks. You have not even formed your core, yet you already formed a law seed, the tortoise rumbled. Cade glanced back at him, faintly confused by the reaction. I guess, he said. The system message didn't really explain much. I've got some ideas based on stories from my world, but I'm not exactly sure what it means. Brahm stared at him but Vorduin raised a claw, silencing the tortoise. The Duke of Desolation regarded Cade with a far more measured look than before, ember eyes studying him with renewed interest. Laws are not a subject for casual discussion while wandering through the frog's jungle, Vorduin said calmly. His gaze lingered for another moment before he turned forward again. We will speak of this another time. The swamp seemed to grow quieter for a moment before Cade continued. After the crucible stopped working, he said, Pearl still had to finish the Great Tree trials. The lightning in the storm sap crucible was part of the trial, so without it she couldn't continue. So I powered it myself. Brahm frowned. How? With my blood, Cade said simply. That earned him a sharp look from both tortoises. The crucible reacted to it, Cade continued. I think it had something to do with the reforging. My body had already been tempered by the lightning inside the tree. Maybe the crucible recognized that. He shrugged slightly. Either way, the lightning started flowing again and Pearl was able to finish the trial. His expression tightened a little. But while I was feeding it, the tree implanted something inside me. The system called it a primordial heartwood rhizome. I don't really understand what it is yet, he admitted. But it's alive. Cade's mouth twisted slightly. And if I'm being honest, I'm not convinced it's a good thing. Brahm's gaze flicked briefly toward Cade's palm before returning to the path ahead. I can feel it inside me, Cade continued quietly. Like roots spreading under my skin. For all I know it's a parasite waiting for the right moment to finish taking me over. Both tortoises remained silent. Then Cade asked the question that had been nagging at him. Have you ever seen anything like that before? Vorduin walked in silence for several steps before answering. No. Cade frowned. Nothing. Neither parasites nor corruption spreads among our kind, Vorduin said calmly. Cade glanced at him. Why? Because of our method of cultivation. Cade's brow furrowed. What do you mean by that? Instead of answering immediately, Vorduin slowed his pace. Observe, the Duke said before he turned slightly toward Brahm. It would benefit you to watch as well. Brahm straightened at once. Ahead of them, a strange plant grew beside a shallow pool. It rose nearly 6 feet tall from the mud, its thick stalk twisting like braided rope. Wide translucent leaves spread outward like glass panes, glowing faintly with a pale green light. At the center of the plant, a bulbous flower pulsed slowly, releasing drifting motes of golden pollen into the humid air. It was beautiful. Vorduin stepped toward it. Cade watched as faint white light began to flicker between the tortoise's jaws. Then, whoosh! A stream of brilliant white flame erupted from Vorduin's mouth. The fire engulfed the plant instantly. The leaves shriveled as the white flames devoured them and the stalk collapsed into ash. The glowing flower at its center burst like a dying star. Within moments, the entire plant was gone. All that remained was a drifting cloud of soft white ash hanging in the air where the plant had once stood. For a moment the ash simply hovered there, swirling lazily above the scorched patch of earth. Then Vorduin inhaled. The movement was subtle but powerful. Air rushed toward him. The floating ash spiraled inward, gathering into a tightening vortex before streaming directly into the Duke's open jaws. Within seconds the ash cloud was gone. The patch of ground where the plant had grown looked completely untouched, as if nothing had ever existed there. Cade blinked. Well, that was. Brahm suddenly brought his fists together and bowed his head deeply toward Vorduin. Thank you for the lesson, Duke, he said with clear respect in his voice. Vorduin acknowledged the gesture with a small nod before turning his attention back to Cade. What did you see, the Duke asked. Cade shrugged slightly. You burned the plant down to ash, then inhaled it. Vorduin huffed. You may have reforged your body, he said, but you still do not possess the sight. Cade frowned. The sight. Vorduin continued walking and Cade hurried slightly to keep pace beside him. The white flames of my kind ignite whatever they touch, Vorduin explained. But what they burn is not merely flesh or matter. The Duke's voice remained calm and measured. Our flames break living things down to their base components, the essence that forms the foundation of their being. Cade glanced back at the spot where the plant had stood. So the ash isn't just ash, Vorduin finished. If the process is done properly and completely, the residue becomes condensed essence. He tapped one claw lightly against his chest. And that essence can be absorbed. Cade blinked. And that's what you just did. Yes. The jungle shifted around them as they continued walking. Thick vines parted as the tortoises pushed through them. A colony of small pale swamp crabs scattered into the mud ahead of their path, vanishing into holes. Cade rubbed his chin thoughtfully. You called it cultivation earlier, he said. You've mentioned that word a few times. What exactly does that mean? I just want to be sure we're on the same page. Vorduin answered without hesitation. As I said before. My kind devours life and reduces it to ash. Within that ash lies concentrated essence. The Duke's ember-bright eyes flicked toward Cade. We absorb that essence to strengthen our bodies and to build and refine our cores. Cade nodded slowly. That's how Brahm healed himself earlier. Brahm grunted in confirmation. Yes. Essence can also be used to mend damage. Cade's thoughts immediately started spinning. So the stronger the thing you burn, the greater the essence contained within it. Cade glanced between the two tortoises. And you think I could do that too? Vorduin studied him for a long moment. I believe it is possible. Cade raised an eyebrow. It will not come easily, the Duke said. Your nature is not that of an ash tortoise and your body was forged through multiple paths. His gaze flicked briefly to Cade's palm where the heartwood rhizome lay hidden beneath the skin. But given enough time, I believe you could learn our methods. Cade felt a slow grin forming. That sounded very good. The system already rewarded him with experience when he killed things. But if he could also absorb their essence afterward to improve his body? His mind raced with the possibilities. If both the system and the ash tortoise's methods worked together, who knew how strong he could eventually become? That's pretty much it, he said. After the great tree shoved the rhizome into my body, I passed out. When I woke up, it wasn't long before I spotted Brahm. Then, he glanced back at the younger tortoise. You know the rest. Brahm gave a low grunt but said nothing. Vorduin walked on in silence, his massive body moving through the swamp with the same calm certainty he brought to everything else. Cade fell quiet too. He had spent the last few hours spilling out everything that had happened since the system came, everything that mattered anyway. The swamp stretched around them in dense, steamy silence. Thick roots rose from the mud. Curtains of moss draped from broad-limbed trees, and stagnant water reflected pale slivers of light through the canopy overhead. Yet despite the living jungle pressing in from all sides, nothing came near them. No insects buzzed close. No beasts rustled in the undergrowth. Even the plants seemed to lean away from the two ash tortoises. They walked for days before the jungle finally began to change, taking minimal breaks to rest. Cade noticed the shift gradually. The mud underfoot thinned. Patches of dark soil gave way to stretches of powdery grey ash. Leaves hanging from the lower branches looked scorched at the edges. Farther ahead, pale haze drifted between the trunks in slow, lazy currents. Then he saw movement. Several squat shapes trudged through the jungle ahead, broad-shelled and low to the ground. They were smaller than Brahm and far smaller than Vorduin, their shells still rough and dull, their steps uneven. White fire flickered uncertainly from their mouths in sputtering bursts as they moved through the dense growth. Vorduin broke the silence. The younglings, he said. Cade slowed slightly, watching as the smaller tortoises spread themselves apart through the jungle. Each gave the others a wide berth, and as they advanced they exhaled white flames into the undergrowth. Plants blackened, curled, and collapsed into drifting pale ash. A moment later the young tortoises inhaled deeply, drawing the ash back into themselves. They start at the front, Vorduin said. The youngest and least experienced are placed where essence is easiest to gather and most abundant. The jungle is dense with life. It offers them plentiful fuel with which to grow. Cade watched one of the younglings belch out a crooked stream of white flame that only half consumed a cluster of reeds before sputtering out. Their fire is not yet pure, Vorduin continued. So they are given the simplest duty. March forward. Burn what they can. Consume as much essence as possible. Ahead of them, beyond the lines of younglings, Cade could make out larger tortoises moving with steadier purpose. Their flames burned cleaner, brighter. Behind them still, deeper within the haze of ash and heat, lumbered even more immense forms. The more experienced follow after, Vorduin said. They consume what the youngest leave behind. Then come the eldest among the front. Their flames are more pure. They scour what little remains and refine the residue left by the younger brethren. His ember-lit eyes shifted toward the pale haze drifting through the trees ahead. And I follow them to ensure that no life remains. Something in those words sent a faint chill through Cade despite the heat. Vorduin turned his head slightly. Brahm. Go ahead. Take your place with the middle ranks. Brahm looked at him sharply, as if he wanted to question the order. But after only a moment he dipped his head. Yes, Duke. Without another word, the younger tortoise veered away to rejoin his place amongst the ranks. Cade watched him go, then glanced at Vorduin. Brahm had a temper. That much was obvious. But he obeyed the older tortoise without argument. Cade had the distinct impression that whatever else Brahm felt, he respected Vorduin too much to challenge him openly. The most promising student of this cycle's clutch, Vorduin said after a moment, as though plucking the thought straight from Cade's mind. Talented, powerful, and ambitious. Cade looked at him. He took it upon himself to move ahead of the front, Vorduin continued. That arrogance should not have been permitted. I should have corrected it sooner. He paused. But what is done. Then the Duke turned his great head toward Cade, ember-bright eyes resting on him with a quiet, expectant look. And besides, Vorduin said, his arrogance and impatience led me to something interesting. Cade blinked. He wasn't entirely sure what kind of response Vorduin expected from him. The ancient tortoise simply stood there watching him, steady and patient, as if waiting for Cade to say something profound. After a moment that stretched just long enough to grow uncomfortable, he cleared his throat. So, Cade said awkwardly. What happens next? Vorduin did not answer immediately. Instead, the Duke tilted his head slightly and regarded Cade with that same expectant look. What would you like to happen next? He eventually asked. Cade opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time since the system had dropped him into this nightmare of a realm, he realized something strange. He actually had both time and the mental capacity to decide what he wanted to do. The thought felt almost foreign. Not entirely the first time, he corrected himself. He'd had something like this with the frogs after the body tempering. There had been space to think, then too space to choose. But his mind had still been fogged over from the reforging, thick and sluggish, like he was only half awake in his own body. This was different. For the first time since the system had thrown him into this nightmare, he felt fully present while having the capacity to make his own decisions. They stood at the edge of the advancing ashen front while the young tortoises trudged steadily forward, burning their way into the jungle. The scent of scorched vegetation drifting through the trees in slow currents. Cade rolled his shoulders slightly. He was tired. The fight with Brahm had wrung him out, and the trek through the swamp afterward hadn't helped. But somewhere along the way his stamina had returned. They had walked slowly enough and occasionally rested so his body was able to recover what he'd spent. He should probably sleep. But the idea of lying down surrounded by ash tortoises didn't exactly fill him with confidence. Vorduin had said he guaranteed Cade's safety. That didn't mean Cade trusted the rest of the tribe not to see him as a convenient source of essence. His thoughts drifted inward. The rhizome was still there. He could feel it if he focused, dormant and coiled inside him. Part of him wanted to start training immediately. If Vorduin actually knew how to get rid of the rhizome planted inside of him, then Cade shouldn't waste time. But another thought crept in. Acalian. The small alligator had been the entire reason Cade ended up in this corrupted dungeon in the first place. The system had practically screamed that the little guy would grow into humanity's ruin inside the tutorial. And yet Cade hadn't seen a single sign of him since the portal. For all he knew, the little gator was out there somewhere in this enormous realm growing into something monstrous. Or maybe he was dead already. Then there was the dungeon itself. At some point, Cade was going to have to find a way out of this place. The thought had barely crossed his mind before now he'd been too busy surviving day by day and trying to learn what he could, but the problem still existed. This corrupted realm was massive. Finding an exit could take months. Maybe even years. But it didn't matter how long it took, he'd find the exit and leave this place. Finally, there was the dungeon quest. Cleanse Cynthia's legacy. He had already burned out the corruption inside the storm sap crucible. That had counted towards completing the quest, but it wasn't finished. Corruption still existed somewhere in this realm. The problem was that this place was impossibly huge. The corruption could be anywhere. Anywhere except. His gaze drifted toward the advancing ashen front. According to Vorduhan, the tortoise's flames purified essence as they consumed it. If corruption existed in the land, the ash tortoises would eventually burn their way through it. That meant staying near them might be the worst strategy to complete the quest. Cade rubbed the back of his neck. He had always been terrible at making big decisions. There were too many variables. Too many unknowns. But if he stripped away everything that wasn't possible right now, the choice became much simpler. At this moment, Cade had two options. He could ask Vorduhan for a safe place to rest and then leave. Or he could take advantage of the tortoise's generosity and start learning. The frog's path hadn't worked for him, but that didn't mean he'd fail at every path. Maybe this one would fit. Cade turned toward the ancient tortoise. I want to learn, he said decisively. Vorduhan's head tilted slightly. Teach me the ways of the ash tortoises, Cade continued. I don't know if I'll actually be good at it. The frogs tried to teach me their paths and that didn't exactly work out. He shrugged. But I'd at least like to try. For a moment, Vorduhan simply watched him. Then a faint glimmer of amusement appeared in the ancient tortoise's ember-bright eyes. I was hoping that would be your answer, the Duke said quietly. Very well. Then we begin with the foundation. The first step toward walking the path of my kind is learning to perceive what already surrounds you. Cade frowned slightly. Perceive what? Essence. The word hung in the air between them. Vorduhan shifted his weight and gestured subtly toward the jungle around them. The young tortoises continued their slow advance through the trees, white flames sputtering as they burned through clusters of reeds and tangled undergrowth. To work with essence, the Duke said calmly, you must first be able to see it, to sense it. Cade blinked. See it? Yes. Okay, that's the thing I'm still confused about, he admitted. You keep talking about essence, but the systems never mentioned anything like that. I've got mana, stamina, and health. He shrugged. Nothing called essence. Vorduhan let out a quiet rumbling chuckle. That is because what you call mana, stamina, and health are merely refined expressions of the same thing. Cade stared at him with a confused expression on his face. Essence, Vorduhan continued, is the foundation of all existence. He gestured again, this time sweeping one claw slowly through the air. Everything that exists contains essence. Life, stone, water, air, lightning, all of it. Essence is the energy of raw existence itself. Cade followed the motion of the tortoise's claw, his brow furrowing. If something exists, Vorduhan said, it possesses essence. The Duke tapped one claw lightly against the ground beneath them. The earth beneath your feet is essence held together by the laws. The air moving through the jungle exists because of essence. The life pulsing in your veins is sustained by essence. He turned his head slightly toward Cade. What you call health is essence refined to sustain the body. Another claw lifted. What you call stamina is essence refined to fuel the body. A faint white glow began to flicker between the edges of Vorduhan's jaws. And what you call mana? The glow brightened. Is essence refined to influence reality beyond the body? Cade watched the light carefully until the glow faded, though his focus lingered on where it had been. He turned the explanation over in his mind, piecing it together. Mana, stamina, health, they weren't separate resource pools. Just different expressions of essence. Thanks for the explanation, Cade said after a moment. Would have been nice if the frogs had just said all that instead of giving me relics and telling me to figure it out myself. Vorduhan chuckled. The frogs do not explain such things, he said. They know them instinctively. As do most creatures of this realm. His gaze rested on Cade. But you are not from this realm. To begin working with essence you must first learn to sense it. To see it for yourself. Cade glanced around the jungle. And I can't do that right now. No. Vorduhan's gaze sharpened slightly. You were baptized by the Ashen Emperor. That much is clear. But that does not mean your body was perfectly refined. It is likely that some impurities remain. They cloud your perception and prevent you from seeing essence clearly. Cade crossed his arms. I thought my body was already fixed, he said. The system even said I have a perfectly reforged body at least until I reach E rank. Vorduin's expression didn't change. Perfection, the Duke said calmly, is a myth. His ember-lit eyes held Cade's. There is always something to be improved. Only those who stop looking believe they have reached perfection. At that, the ancient tortoise's expression shifted. A faint, almost mischievous smile crept into the corner of Vorduin's mouth. Watch closely, the Duke said. He turned his head toward a small plant growing beside the path. White flames began to flicker once more between the edges of his jaws. As they did, Vorduin continued speaking. Essence within the body responds to will and intent. The white flames grew brighter. I gather the essence inside myself and guide it through my channels. The air around his mouth shimmered faintly as the energy gathered. As the essence flows, it changes form according to my channels and my intent. The white flames now danced across the inside of his mouth like living fire. My intent, in this moment, Vorduin said calmly, is to sever the connections within the life essence of that plant. The flames brightened further. So as my essence travels through my channels, it becomes flame. Cade watched carefully. Then a thought clicked. Because it's your essence, he said slowly, it doesn't hurt you. Vorduin's ember-lit eyes shifted toward him. That is correct. The Duke gave a faint nod. A good observation. Now watch. Vorduin exhaled. A narrow stream of concentrated white flame rushed from between his jaws and struck the plant beside the path. The effect was instantaneous. The leaves shriveled and collapsed before the fire had even fully touched them. The stem blackened, then disintegrated entirely. In less than a second the entire plant had been reduced to a small cloud of pale ash drifting gently through the air. Cade barely had time to blink. The ash hovered where the plant had stood, swirling lazily above the scorched patch of earth. Vorduin did not inhale this time. Instead, the Duke continued speaking. Because I was the one who severed the plant's life essence, he said calmly, the condensed essence responds to my will. The floating ash stirred slightly. It follows my intent. Cade watched the drifting cloud carefully, waiting to see what the tortoise would do next. Then the ash moved. Cade had just enough time to realize something was wrong. The cloud of condensed essence shot forward in a sudden burst of motion straight at his face. What? The ash slammed into his eyes. Cade staggered back with a strangled cry, hands flying to his face as agony tore through his skull. It felt as if molten needles had been driven straight through his eyes and into his brain. He dropped to his knees in the dirt. Feel it, Vorduin's voice said calmly somewhere above him. Do not resist. Cade barely heard the words. Pain roared through his head, drowning out everything else. His eyes burned as his pain ran deeper through the nerves behind his eyes and back into the occipital lobe of his brain. It felt horribly familiar. Cade clenched his teeth, forcing himself not to scream as the burning sensation pushed deeper. His eyes tried to water, but nothing came out. The essence burrowed inward. Through his eyes. Through the nerves behind them. Through the pathways that carried sight itself. Trace it, Vorduin instructed. Follow where it moves. Cade forced himself to focus through the pain. The essence was moving. He could feel it. Thin streams of energy pushed along delicate pathways behind his eyes, threading through nerves and spreading deeper into the lattice of connections that fed into his brain. The sensation was nearly unbearable, but even through the pain, Cade understood what Vorduin meant. The essence was carving paths through him. Burning them open just as it had done during the ashen baptism. He felt something warm trickle down his cheeks. Cade blinked blindly. Dark droplets splattered onto the ashen ground beneath him. Thick, dark, almost oily blood seeped from the corners of his eyes and dripped steadily onto the soil. Vorduin observed the sight calmly. As expected, the Duke said. Cade barely managed to hear him through the roaring in his skull. The Ashen Emperor's baptism cleansed you, Vorduin continued, but you were likely near death when it occurred. Survival was your body's priority. Not refinement. Another wave of burning surged through Cade's vision. You endured the rite, the Duke said, but you did not receive its full benefits. Cade dug his fingers into the dirt as the essence continued to burn through his nerves. More blackened blood slid down his face. Consider this a correction, Vorduin finished calmly. At first Cade couldn't focus on anything. Colors bled together in strange, shifting patches that reminded him of watercolors soaked into wet paper. The jungle floor beneath him was a blurred mixture of greens and browns that seemed to flow into each other without clear edges. His head throbbed faintly, but the burning agony from earlier had faded. Ding! Passive skill gained Essence Sight. Essence Sight, uncommon, your vision has now been attuned to see pure and life-attuned essence. He blinked again. Slowly, the colors began to sharpen. The watery smears tightened into clearer forms. What had looked like a blur beneath his leg slowly resolved into the outline of a small plant pushing up through the earth. Cade leaned forward slightly. Something inside the plant caught his attention. A faint streak of green ran through the blur. As he stared, the streak sharpened. The hazy line grew thinner. Finer. More defined. Until finally it came fully into focus. A needle-thin thread of green extended from the soil beneath the plant, running straight up through its stem. The line glowed faintly, almost too dim to notice unless he was looking directly at it. Cade watched it carefully. A moment later, the line pulsed. The movement was incredibly faint, like a slow heartbeat traveling up a thread. Cade leaned closer, fascinated. Then he heard Vorduin clear his throat. The sound snapped him out of his concentration. He lifted his gaze and immediately froze. For a moment his brain struggled to reconcile what he was seeing. The large tortoise stood before him. Vorduin's massive frame hadn't changed: leathery skin, ancient limbs, and the brilliant pearlescent shell that reflected the light from above. His ember-lit eyes still burned steadily in the heat of the jungle. But now Cade saw something else layered over that familiar image. Lines. Dozens of them. No, hundreds. Strands of pale light traced their way across Vorduin's body, weaving through muscle and shell in a complex network. They branched and split and rejoined again, forming intricate pathways that spread through every part of the tortoise's immense frame. And at the center of it all, Cade's eyes widened. A brilliant white light burned deep within Vorduin's body. It sat roughly where the tortoise's stomach would be, but the glow was so intense that Cade instinctively squinted. It was difficult to look at directly. Lines extended outward from that blinding point. They radiated through Vorduin's body like the roots of an enormous tree. Vorduin watched Cade calmly. "Judging by your expression," the Duke said, "I assume the world looks somewhat different now." Cade swallowed. "Yeah," he said quietly. His hands trembled slightly as he continued staring. "What is this?" "You can now perceive the flow of essence around you," Vorduin replied. "At least in part." Cade shook his head slowly, still trying to absorb what he was seeing. "Is this how all of you see the world?" he asked. Vorduin tilted his head slightly. "How would I know? I cannot see what you see," the ancient tortoise continued. "I have no frame of reference for your perception." He lifted one claw and pointed toward his own belly. "But I can explain what you are looking at." Cade followed the gesture immediately. "That," Vorduin said, "is my core." Cade stared at the blinding white light. "It's bright," he muttered. "Really bright." He squinted slightly. "I can see lines coming off it." "Good," Vorduin said as he gave a small nod. "Those are my channels." Cade's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied the glowing network. The structure felt familiar, not identical but close enough to stir recognition. In the storm sap crucible, he had seen something similar, channels grown into the construct that guided energy through deliberate paths. But Vorduin's channels were different. They were arranged in another configuration entirely, woven through flesh instead of wood. Cade assumed the difference in pattern was what forced the essence into producing different effects. The white lines spread outward from the core and wove their way through Vorduin's entire body. They ran along his limbs, wrapped through the thick muscles of his neck, and even extended into the massive plates of his shell. The network was everywhere. Cade's gaze followed the channels upward from the core until they reached the tortoise's throat. The lines coming up from the core were thick. Strong, steady conduits carrying the bright white light upward through Vorduin's body. "Now," Vorduin said calmly, "look at the channels leading into my mouth." As the lines approached the throat they changed. The channels grew thinner and began twisting together, splitting and crossing over one another. By the time they reached the tortoise's mouth the network had become a tangled web so dense that Cade struggled to separate one strand from another. It looked almost like a nest of glowing white roots packed tightly into the tortoise's jaw. Vorduin's voice rumbled calmly beside him. "In order to generate flame, we guide essence from our core through these channels." Cade watched the tangled network carefully. One's wool, combined with the channels, transforms the essence as it flows, Vorduin continued. His ember-lit eyes flicked toward Cade. And what emerges? A faint white glow began flickering between the edges of the tortoise's jaws. Is the fire of our path. Now, watch again, Vorduin said. Cade didn't take his eyes off the tortoise. Now that he could see the channels and the core, the entire process felt different. Before, Vorduin's flames had seemed almost effortless, like the tortoise simply breathed destruction into the world. Now Cade realized there was far more happening beneath the surface. Vorduin turned slightly and selected another small plant. It was little more than a cluster of thin leaves pushing through the dark soil. Observe. Cade focused. For a brief moment nothing happened. Then the brilliant white light at the center of Vorduin's body flared. At the same time, the channels leading upward from the core brightened. White light surged through them. Cade watched in fascination as the essence rushed upward through the tortoise's body like a current through a network of glowing veins. The streams moved quickly, flowing up the channels that led toward Vorduin's throat. As the essence reached the tangled mass of channels near his mouth, the light twisted through the dense web. White flames flickered into existence between the corners of the tortoise's jaws. Cade saw the transformation, but it was so complex that it was still hard to follow. The flowing essence twisted through the complex web of channels, and as it did, the light changed. It thickened, brightened, transformed and became flame. A moment later Vorduin exhaled. A narrow jet of white fire burst from his mouth and engulfed the small plant. Cade followed the flames with his eyes, but they were almost too bright to perceive clearly. They appeared as a dense splash of white against the plant's green tendrils. The flames wrapped around the plant entirely. Within that glowing cloud Cade could still see the plant's life essence. The needle-thin green thread that had run through its stem was now completely surrounded by the white blaze. Then the thread vanished, consumed by the white flames that swallowed it whole. A second later the flames receded and a loose cloud of pale white essence drifted lazily through the air. Cade leaned forward slightly. In his old sight it would have looked like nothing more than a faint puff of ash. But with his new vision he saw something entirely different. Soft white clouds floated above the soil patches of pure essence hanging in the air. As he watched, the clouds began to shift. Vorduin's voice rumbled beside him. My flames enveloped the plant completely, the Duke said. The one I chose was simple. Its life essence was weak. Cade continued staring at the drifting white shapes. As the flames consume the plant, Vorduin continued, they break down the structure of its essence. The clouds slowly began shrinking. The life-attuned essence is dismantled and, by my will, it is reduced to its most fundamental form. Pure essence. The drifting patches of light tightened, condensing down as it shrank further. What had once been soft clouds of pale light began pulling together into smaller and smaller clusters. Then the clusters began changing shape. The hazy watercolor patches sharpened. Edges formed and the essence within grew brighter. Until finally the drifting clouds collapsed into tiny, brilliant points of light. Bright white pinpricks floating gently through the air. Cade stared, fascinated with Vorduin's display. Each tiny point shone with a clean white brilliance. They were nowhere near as bright as the blazing core within Vorduin's body, but compared to the faint green thread he had seen inside the plant earlier, they were dazzling. With the plant's structure gone, Vorduin said calmly, its essence now responds only to my will. Vorduin inhaled. The particles stirred, then lifted from the air and flowed toward the tortoise's open jaws. Cade followed them closely. The glowing specks passed into Vorduin's mouth and vanished as they merged seamlessly with the network of bright channels inside his body. Added to the blazing white core burning at the center of the ancient tortoise. Cade sat back on his heels. That was incredible, he said. But fascination quickly gave way to another thought. He glanced up at the ancient tortoise. Okay, Cade said. That was amazing to watch, but how am I supposed to do something like that? Vorduin let out a deep rumbling chuckle. Patience, the Duke said. One step at a time. He shifted his weight slightly, the glowing lines of essence within his body moving like slow rivers beneath his skin. What I demonstrated, Vorduin continued, is what lies ahead on this path. Cade frowned slightly. You are not there yet, the tortoise went on calmly. Right now you are little more than a hatchling. And hatchlings cannot liberate their own flame without enough essence. He gestured with one claw toward the scorched patch of ground. In the beginning, you must rely on others to generate pure essence for you to absorb, Vorduin finished. The Duke stepped toward another plant growing nearby. This one was even smaller than the last, little more than a thin sprout with a pair of tiny leaves pushing its way out of the soil. Cade's new sight focused on it immediately. A faint green line extended upward from the ground through the plant's stem. It was so thin he almost missed it. This one will suffice, Vorduin said. He turned his head slightly toward Cade. I will break the plant down into pure essence. Afterward, you will absorb what remains. Wait. Vorduin paused. Before we do that, can you explain how I'm supposed to absorb it? The ancient tortoise looked mildly surprised. If you were the one who destroyed the plant, Vorduin said slowly, you would simply guide the essence into yourself. He tapped his chest lightly with one claw. You would extend a tendril of your own essence. Wrap it around the condensed particles. Then draw them inward. Cade stared at him. I have absolutely no idea how to do that. Vorduin made a small tisk sound. The frogs truly taught you nothing, did they? Cade gave a weak shrug. Not about this. The Duke sighed. Very well. Vorduin turned back toward the tiny plant. For now we will use a simpler method. He gestured toward the ground in front of the plant. When the essence is condensed, you will simply breathe it in. Cade blinked. Seriously? Yes. Vorduin's voice remained completely matter-of-fact. The condensed essence will enter your body and merge with your own. Cade eyed the tiny plant again. That sounds suspiciously easy. It is the method used by our hatchlings, of course it is going to be easy. Vorduin's jaws began glowing faintly once more. Lean down, he instructed. When the essence forms, inhale it. Cade hesitated for a moment before he crouched lower, bringing his face closer to where the plant met the ground. All right, he muttered. I guess I'm ready. White flames flickered between the corners of Vorduin's mouth. Cade watched carefully as the brilliant light from the tortoise's core surged through the glowing channels once more. A moment later the flames erupted forward. The tiny plant vanished inside a bloom of white fire. Cade's new sight tracked the process closely. The thin green strand running through the plant was swallowed instantly by the bright white cloud. The life essence unraveled within the flames and broke apart into soft drifting patches of pale light. Just like before, the clouds shrank, condensed down as they collapsed inward until only tiny white points remained floating in the air. Now, Vorduin said. Breathe. Cade leaned forward, shoving his face into the drifting cloud and inhaled sharply. The tiny particles lifted from the air immediately. They floated toward his mouth and slipped past his lips as he breathed them in. For a brief moment Cade felt nothing. Then the essence touched his tongue and warmth spread through his body. The sensation flowed down his throat and dispersed through his chest like a gentle current moving through still water. The essence dissolved into him. Merged with him. Cade blinked in surprise as the warmth spread through his limbs. Then a familiar notification flickered into existence in the corner of his vision. You have gained experience. Cade blinked at the system notification hovering in the corner of his vision. You have gained experience. The message lingered for a moment before he willed it away. Cade remained crouched where he was, still tasting the faint warmth left behind by the essence he had inhaled. The sensation had already begun to dissipate, leaving behind a gentle calm in his body. But the system message stuck in his mind. Cade sat back on his heels. Why did that give me experience? Normally the system only awarded experience when he killed something. Monsters, beasts, the lords of the swamp, each kill had granted experience that slowly pushed him toward his next level. He hadn't killed the plant, Vorduin had. Cade frowned slightly. Unless... His mind began turning the idea over. The tortoise had burned the plant down and condensed its essence. Then Cade absorbed that essence into himself and the system had notified that he gained experience. Maybe the system doesn't actually care about the kill. Cade's eyes narrowed slightly as the thought formed. Maybe it cares about the essence, the underlying foundation of reality. If essence was the fundamental energy of existence like Vorduin said, then it would make sense for the system to measure growth using that same energy. Cade's thoughts were interrupted by Vorduin's rumbling voice. How was your first experience purposefully absorbing essence? Cade looked up at the ancient tortoise. Something unexpected happened, he admitted. Vorduin tilted his head slightly, his ember-lit eyes watching calmly. Would you be willing to help me run a few experiments? A deep chuckle rumbled out of Vorduin's chest. You truly are like a hatchling, the tortoise said with amusement. You have tasted essence once and already you crave more. Cade gave a sheepish shrug. Something like that. Then his expression grew more thoughtful. The system told me I gained experience when I absorbed the essence you produced, he explained. I want to see if that happens again. I want to see if the amount of essence I absorb changes how much experience I get. Vorduin listened quietly. The ancient tortoise's gaze sharpened slightly at the mention of the system, but he didn't comment on it. Instead, he inclined his head. Very well. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. This experiment aligns with your training regardless. Cade grinned. Great. He stood up and brushed the dirt from his knees. Then could you find something with a little more essence this time? Vorduin huffed softly. That will not be difficult. He turned and walked a short distance away before stopping beside a bush nearly half as tall as Cade. The plant spread outward in a dense cluster of thin branches, each one covered in small, glossy leaves and dozens of bright red berries that glistened in the light. In Cade's essence sight, the bush looked very different. A single green strand of life-attuned essence ran along the central stem. It was thicker than the one he had seen in the previous plant, though not by much. Smaller threads branched off the main line, extending outward through each of the bush's branches. But what really caught Cade's attention were the berries. In his normal sight they looked like nothing more than bright red fruit. But with his new skill he could see they were blazing. Each berry glowed with dense green life essence that far outshone the thin strands running through the stems. Cade leaned forward slightly. Wait, he said. Vorduin paused. Can you separate the essence after breaking it down? The Duke glanced back at him. Clarify. Cade pointed toward the bush. The berries are packed with essence, he said. Way more than the stem and branches. Could you condense the essence from the berries separately from the rest of the plant? Vorduin studied him for a moment. That level of manipulation is not meant for beginners, the ancient tortoise said. It would be more beneficial for you to observe the essence of the entire plant condensed at once. That is the next step you will eventually perform yourself. I get that, but could you humor me, he asked, a faint grin spreading across his face. Vorduin huffed softly and after a moment, the Duke turned back toward the bush. Very well. White flames flickered to life between the corners of his jaws. Cade watched intently as the tortoise exhaled. The bush vanished inside a bloom of brilliant white fire. Through his essence sight Cade saw the plant's green strands engulfed by a swirling cloud of white. The life essence unraveled under the assault of Vorduin's flames, breaking apart into drifting clouds of pale light. Some of the drifting essence gathered together in smaller clusters while other portions condensed into thicker, brighter masses. Cade watched as the essence from the stems and branches drifted into one group while the essence from the berries formed into another. In his normal vision, Cade saw two distinct masses of ash floating where the plant had stood. One was noticeably smaller and looser, the particles spreading thinly through the air. The other cloud was larger and far denser, the ash packed tightly together as it hovered above the scorched ground. Even without his new sight the difference was obvious. But through his essence sight the contrast was even more dramatic. The larger cloud shone far brighter. The white particles within it glowed with a dense brilliance, each pinprick of condensed essence radiating far more strongly than those in the smaller cloud. Cade watched the two clouds carefully. So the amount of ash and the density correlates to the amount of essence within, he thought. The larger cloud clearly contained far more essence than the smaller one. Cade leaned forward and shoved his face into the smaller cloud first and inhaled deeply. The ash stirred and drifted toward him. Tiny white pinpricks floated through the air and into his mouth as he breathed in. The moment the condensed essence touched him, the familiar warmth spread through his body. It was the same gentle sensation he had felt before. Another notification flickered into existence. You have gained experience. Cade leaned back slightly as he willed the notification closed. The warmth within him dissipated. Okay, he thought. So that wasn't a one-time thing. Absorbing essence definitely triggered the system. But the experiment wasn't done yet. Cade turned toward the larger cloud. The dense mass of ash hovered patiently in the air beside him, the condensed essence within it shining brightly in his new sight. He leaned forward again and inhaled. This time the sensation was different. The warmth that entered his body was stronger. It spread through his chest and limbs with greater intensity, lingering longer as the essence integrated into him. Cade felt his muscles relax slightly. The dull aches left behind by his fight with Brahm eased a little. Even the faint headache that had been nagging him since he deactivated hyper-focused meditation softened around the edges. The essence flowed through him before finally settling. Another system notification. You have gained experience. Cade frowned slightly. The message was identical to the first. No indication of how much experience he had gained. Just the same simple notification. Then again, the system had never shown him hard numbers for experience before. But in the past it had said that he gained extra experience for killing a creature above his level. Was that just due to the difference in essence within something stronger than himself? He sat there for a moment, thinking. If the system was converting absorbed essence into experience, then the amount of essence should matter. The second cloud clearly contained more and it definitely felt different when he absorbed it. But the system message didn't change. Either the system isn't showing the difference for some reason. Or I just don't have enough data yet. Cade exhaled slowly. There were too many unknown variables. He needed more information. More tests. More samples. Eventually he nodded to himself. I need more data points to make any conclusions. The warmth from the essence faded completely as his body finished integrating it. Cade stood up, brushed the dirt from his hands, then he turned toward Vorduin and gave the ancient tortoise a short nod. I'm ready for another round. For the first time since they began training, Vorduin looked slightly surprised. Cade noticed the expression immediately. What? He asked. The Duke studied him carefully. I did not expect you to absorb the essence so quickly. Cade blinked. Isn't that what you told me to do? Yes, Vorduin said slowly. But that much essence would be difficult for our hatchlings to process. He gestured toward Cade with one claw. When I observe you with my sight, the essence enters your body and merges with your own as if it belongs there. That's not normal. Not for beginners. Vorduin's gaze sharpened slightly. Most hatchlings require time to force the essence to settle within their channels. You absorbed it effortlessly. Cade rubbed his chin thoughtfully. I wonder if that's the system. Vorduin did not interrupt, but his eyes sharpened with interest. The system gives me experience when I kill things, Cade explained. But I got the exact same notification when I absorbed the essence from those plants. So I'm starting to think the system might actually be converting essence into experience. Cade paused. Or maybe it's integrating the essence into my body and just calling it experience. I don't really know yet. Vorduin hummed thoughtfully. That is, interesting. Tell me, what exactly is this system you speak of? Cade shrugged. For all I know it's an all-powerful entity controlling everything. He began counting on his fingers. It shows me my stats. Tells me when I level up. Gives me skills. Assigns quests that seem designed to push me in certain directions. He paused suddenly. Wait. Cade looked up. You don't have the system. Vorduin shook his head slowly. I possess a record that categorizes and defines my cultivation but nothing as advanced as what you have described. Cade opened his mouth to ask another question but Vorduin raised a claw. That discussion can wait. The ancient tortoise gestured toward the jungle around them. For now we focus on your training. You need to continue absorbing essence. Your channels still require filling. What do you mean by filling my channels? Vorduin regarded him calmly. Learning to control the flow of essence within the body is easiest when the channels are full, the ancient tortoise explained. Even with the essence you have already absorbed, yours are nearly empty. Cade instinctively glanced down at himself. With his new sight he could faintly see thin lines running through his own arms and torso far dimmer and less defined than the brilliant network inside Vorduin's body. They looked almost fragile by comparison. So I just fill them up? Cade asked. In a sense. Vorduin shifted his weight slightly. If you possessed a core, this process would be simple. You would draw essence from the core and flood your channels with it. Then you would learn to guide and shape that flow. The Duke tapped Cade's torso lightly with one claw. But you do not yet possess a core. Cade grimaced slightly. Right. I'm still working on that. So instead, Vorduin continued, you must rely on external essence. By absorbing it and integrating it into yourself, you will slowly fill your channels. Cade frowned thoughtfully. And that helps me control it later. Yes. The tortoise nodded. When the channels are full, you will feel the essence moving within you. From there I will teach you how to guide it. How to shape it. How to use it. Cade's curiosity flared immediately. What comes after that? Vorduin's eyes glinted faintly. That is a lesson for another time. Cade sighed quietly. Part of him wanted to push further. To demand the whole roadmap right now. He wanted to know where this led and what he would eventually be capable of if he continued down the ash tortoise's path. But another part of him understood what the tortoise meant. None of that mattered if he couldn't even take the first step. He took a slow breath. One step at a time. You're right, he said aloud. I should just focus on absorbing essence for now. A faint smile tugged at the corner of Vorduan's mouth. Wise. The ancient tortoise looked around the clearing briefly before returning his gaze to Cade. I believe you are ready to absorb more than the paltry amount provided by these plants. Cade glanced around the jungle. Yeah, he said. Maybe you could burn down a whole patch around us. Condense it into one big cloud of essence for me to absorb. Vorduan huffed quietly. You underestimate how little essence these plants contain. The life within them is faint. Even an entire patch would provide only a modest increase. The tortoise's eyes drifted toward the deeper jungle beyond the ashen front. Living creatures contain far greater and denser quantities of life essence. Cade followed his gaze. So you must hunt. Vorduan gestured toward the jungle behind them. Go into the swamp. Find a living creature. Kill it. Then bring the body back here. Cade frowned. And then? I will strip the corpse of its essence, Vorduan said. And you will absorb it. Cade glanced into the jungle. The trees were thick and tangled beyond the ashen front, the undergrowth dense with life that had not yet been consumed by the advancing tortoises. He looked back at Vorduan. You're not coming with me. The Duke shook his head slowly. If I did, you would find nothing. Cade blinked, then he remembered the way animals had scattered earlier when the tortoises passed. That's right. If Vorduan came along, the entire jungle would empty itself before I got close. Cade sighed and rolled his shoulders. All right. He turned toward the jungle they had come from. Guess I'm going hunting. Cade moved through the swamp alone, bare feet sinking slightly into the damp earth with each step. The air was still thick and humid, clinging to his skin like a second layer, but the silence that had followed Vorduan and Brahm was gone. Insects buzzed in uneven rhythms around him. Something small darted through the undergrowth to his left, rustling leaves before vanishing. Farther off, something heavier splashed through shallow water. Above him, branches shook as unseen creatures leapt from limb to limb. Cade exhaled slowly, adjusting to the shift. Without the oppressive presence of the ash tortoises, the jungle no longer recoiled. Instead, it pressed in around him alive, watchful, and full of movement. Cade's gaze drifted to a cluster of low bushes beside the path. In his essence sight, thin green lines traced through their stems faint, almost fragile threads of life weaving up from the ground and branching outward. He stepped past them, glancing toward a larger tree nearby. The difference was immediate. The tree's trunk held a much thicker line of green essence, pulsing slowly as it rose upward and spread through the branches above. Smaller offshoots extended into each limb, like veins feeding the canopy. Every plant, every living thing had green lines running through them. Cade's attention snapped to movement in his peripheral vision as a pair of oversized mosquitoes buzzed past him. In his normal sight they were little more than blurs. In his essence sight they were streaks of faint green thin, flickering traces of life darting through the air before vanishing into the foliage. He kept walking. Time blurred as he moved deeper through the swamp, his attention constantly pulled between the physical world and the web of essence layered over it. He found himself staring at things he would have ignored before, watching the way life essence pulsed through roots, how it gathered more densely in thicker plants, how even the smallest sprouts held a thread of it. It was fascinating. Time passed and Cade barely noticed the distance he'd covered. It was strange, without something trying to kill him, the swamp almost felt peaceful. The noise, the movement, even the thick air, it all settled into something calm. His gaze settled on a large cypress tree rising from a shallow pool of still water. Its thick trunk twisted upward, roots spreading into the murky water below. Something about it caught his attention and Cade slowed. Essence sight showed a bright, concentrated mass of life essence clung to the tree. It stood out sharply against the steady, pulsing lines that ran through the rest of the trunk. Cade frowned slightly and stepped closer, eyes narrowing as he studied it. What is that? Behind him, the swamp shifted. The muck stirred as subtle ripples spread across the shallow water. Then, slowly, several thick roots began to rise from beneath the surface. They pushed upward through the mud in silence, slick with dark water as they uncoiled. Their tips sharpened as they lifted. Cade didn't notice. His attention remained fixed on the strange mass of essence in the tree. For a brief moment, everything stilled. Then the roots struck. They shot forward like spears, cutting through the air with sudden, violent speed. Cade felt the impact a split second later. A dull, heavy force slammed into his back, driving him a half step forward. He stumbled. What? Cade spun around instinctively, heart spiking as his mind scrambled to catch up. Behind him, several thick roots jutted from the ground, their sharpened ends hovering exactly where his torso had been a heartbeat ago. Another root snapped forward. Cade jerked to the side, barely avoiding the strike as it punched into the ground where he'd been standing. His thoughts raced. Why didn't that hurt more? Then an instant later it clicked. Toughness. He had reforged his body and it wasn't the same as before. Another root lashed out. Cade twisted, stepping back as it carved through the air in front of him. His eyes flicked over the roots, tracking them carefully. In his essence sight, thin green lines ran through them. They were faint, barely thicker than the tiny plant Vorduun had burned earlier. Cade frowned even as another strike launched toward him. He dodged again, feet splashing through shallow water as he shifted position. The roots were large and they looked sharp enough to skewer him if they hit right. But compared to Cade's natural toughness, the sharpened tips may as well have been blunt butter knives. And the essence running through them was weak. Cade moved again as another spear-like root shot toward him. He wasn't about to stand still and find out the hard way if his toughness-enhanced body could handle repeated strikes. As he circled, his gaze followed the threads of essence running through the roots. They all led back to the tree. Cade's eyes narrowed as the connection clicked into place. Of course there would be sentient plants in this green hell, he muttered. His focus snapped to the trunk and he used Identify. Quick growth cypress, a common wetland tree that grows rapidly in environments rich in mana. Cade stared at it for half a second. Wow! Looks like my Identify is still completely useless. He ducked under another sweeping root and pivoted around the base of the cypress tree, his feet splashing through the shallow water. The roots followed. They twisted through the mud with unnatural speed, striking from new angles as if anticipating his movements. Cade barely avoided another thrust, the sharpened tip passing close enough that he felt the air shift against his skin. Even with a lesser quality Identify, it should have mentioned something about sentience and root spears. His gaze snapped back to the trunk. In his essence sight he could see that the life essence within the cypress didn't flow like the other trees he had seen. It didn't pulse evenly from root to branch. Instead it pooled halfway up the trunk. Right where that dense knot of green had previously caught his attention. Cade's eyes narrowed but another root shot toward him. He twisted aside, water spraying as his foot slid across the muddy ground. He kept moving, circling the tree. If the source of the attack was tied to that cluster of essence, then he needed a better angle. The roots lashed out again. Cade ducked, then stepped through a gap between two strikes, pushing himself around to the opposite side of the trunk. His shoulder brushed against damp bark as he moved. He saw the bulging mass protruding from the tree. At first glance it looked like a burl, a natural growth, rough and uneven, blending almost perfectly with the bark around it. But then it twitched. Cade froze for half a second. Yet, that's not part of the tree. The burl shifted again, subtle but unmistakable. Cade quickly used Identify again. Root spike stag beetle level 12. A large wetland beetle with a durable shell. Its bark-toned carapace helps it blend against trees. It uses roots and uneven terrain to launch sudden attacks at its prey. Shit, that was actually useful, he muttered. Then he had to move again as another root came stabbing toward his side. He twisted away, breath quickening as the fight sharpened his senses. Cade's eyes flicked back to the beetle. Now that he knew what he was looking for, he could see it clearly. The burl was its body, pressed flat against the trunk. Its legs were anchored deep into the bark, gripping tightly. And in his essence sight he spotted the thin lines of green that extended through the beetle's legs and merged with the tree's own essence. That's how it's doing it. It wasn't the tree attacking him. It was the beetle controlling the tree's roots. Another barrage of roots shot toward him. Cade ducked, then stepped forward instead of back, closing the distance. He had no weapon. Nothing but his own body. He dodged again, slipping between two strikes as he moved closer to the trunk. Cade clenched his fist. Guess I'm doing this the hard way. He surged forward, timing his movement between more incoming roots. His fist slammed into the beetle's carapace. The impact jolted up his arm instantly. It felt like punching steel. Cade's teeth clenched as the force rebounded through his bones, his arm vibrating from the strike. The beetle didn't budge. Okay, he hissed as he staggered back half a step, shaking his hand slightly. That's not gonna work. The roots came again. He dodged, slipping to the side as another spear-like strike buried itself into the mud where he'd just been standing. Cade exhaled sharply, mind racing. He needed something. Anything. His eyes flicked down to his right hand. The skin had healed over and now looked normal. But he could still feel the rhizome within. Alive just beneath the surface. He hesitated. A familiar unease crept into his chest. He had used it in his fight against Brahm. He remembered the feeling of it growing out of his skin. Feeding off of his resources, off of him. And now he was forced to use it again. Cade grimaced. Another root speared toward his chest but Cade twisted, the sharpened tip grazing past him as he stepped through the opening. Mud splashed underfoot as he kept moving, refusing to let himself get pinned in place. His breathing steadied as he reached inward toward the parasite buried beneath his skin. It pulsed faintly in response. Cade clenched his jaw and focused his will. He needed something he could use to pry the beetle off of the tree. He bet if he disconnected it from the tree itself, then the beetle would no longer be able to control the roots and would be easy pickings. Grow. The response was immediate. A sharp, invasive sensation spread through his right hand as something shifted beneath the surface. It wasn't pain, not exactly, but it felt wrong. Like something that didn't belong was forcing its way through him. Cade's fingers twitched as wood split through skin on his palm, sliding outward in twisting strands of dark, living fiber. The growth coiled over itself, thickening, extending, shaping itself as he guided it with his will. He felt it draw from him. A sudden drain ripped through his body as the rhizome fed on his health, stamina, and mana. All three dropped at once, a third of each torn away and funneled into the growth forming in his grasp. Fuck me. He staggered half a step but forced himself to stay upright as the weapon finished forming. 2 meters of hardened wood extended from his hand, forming a dark, ridged spear etched with faint fractal patterns. They looked strangely familiar, but he didn't have time to study them. In his essence sight, Cade could see a faint green line connecting the weapon to his palm. He tightened his grip. The weapon felt solid and yet his stomach twisted. I cannot wait to get this thing out of me. He could feel it inside him. A parasite that was using him just as much as he was using it. Another root lashed toward him. Cade snapped back into motion as he surged forward. The beetle remained anchored to the tree, its body pressed flat against the bark as its legs pulsed with essence that controlled the assailing roots. Cade's eyes narrowed. The connection was obvious now. As long as the beetle stayed fused to the tree, it could keep using the roots to attack him. If he could pry it loose, maybe the roots would stop moving altogether. He closed the distance in a burst of movement, slipping between two incoming strikes, and drove the spear forward, jamming the tip into the slight gap between the beetle's body and the tree. Even as he pushed, the carapace held firm. The beetle's grip remained anchored to the trunk. Cade gritted his teeth as he used leverage to his advantage. Come on! He pushed harder, using his full strength, bracing his footing in the mud. Then something gave. With a sharp, tearing sound, the beetle's grip broke and its body peeled away from the trunk as broken bark rained down. The moment it lost contact, all of the roots dropped at once, falling limp into the mud, lifeless without the beetle's control. As it fell, the beetle shifted. Its shell split as thin, translucent wings began to unfurl from beneath the carapace. Cade didn't give the beetle a chance to escape. He brought the shaft of the spear down hard, slamming it into the creature's back and pinning it to the ground before it could take flight. Mud splashed outward on impact. The beetle twitched, its wings half extended. He didn't hesitate. Through his essence sight, a denser knot of life essence burned within the beetle's body, faint compared to Vorduin's core, but far brighter than anything in its limbs or the tree. He adjusted his grip and drove the wooden spear tip downward, targeting that point. It punched between the beetle's plates where it found soft tissue. The beetle twitched then went still. In his essence sight, he saw something within the beetle's body shift. A faint wisp of green lifted off of the body and drifted toward him. As it moved, the color faded. The green thinned until it turned pale, then nearly transparent, so faint it was almost invisible even with his enhanced vision. It slipped into him, but unlike the essence from ash, he felt no warmth at all. A moment later, as it settled within him, Cade received a system notification he hadn't seen since before entering Cynthia's legacy. Ding! You have defeated Root Spike Stag Beetle level 12. You have gained additional experience for killing a creature above your level. Race, human, F, has reached level 10. +2 to all stats. Cade blinked and his grip on the spear loosened slightly. What? His gaze dropped back to the corpse. Strands of green still lingered within its body, slowly fading as they bled into the air, yet they were undeniably still there. Cade's brow furrowed. Was that translucent wisp experience? Cade's focus shifted inward as he pulled up his status. Status. Name, Cade Whitehollow. Age, 26. Race, Human, F, LVL 10. Health points, HP 605/605. Stamina points, SP 572/572. Mana points, MP 583/583. Statistics. Strength, 34, 49, 36, 52. Dexterity, 33, 47, 35, 50. Endurance, 34, 49, 36, 52. Toughness, 31, 44, 33, 47. Vitality, 35, 52, 37, 55. Wisdom, 37, 53, 39, 56. Intelligence, 35, 50, 37, 53. Willpower, 54, 78, 56, 81. Titles, A Brutal Welcome, Coreless Conqueror, Shepherd the Young, 111th Integration Pioneer, Perfectly Reforged Body, Coreless Lawbearer. Law Seed, Inviolable Self. Quests, Tutorial Quest, Lords of the Swamp, Dungeon Quest, Cleanse Cynthia's Legacy. Race Skills, Unbroken Will, Identify, Lesser, Hyper-Focused Meditation, Rare, Essence Sight, Uncommon. Sage leaned against Earl as they pushed through the swamp, his arm draped over the larger man's shoulders. Each step jarred something deep in his torso, a sharp, grinding discomfort that made even breathing feel painful. Earl didn't seem to notice. Man, Earl said with a short laugh, adjusting his grip, you're lighter than you look. Sage exhaled slowly through his nose. I'm using a skill. Oh. Earl glanced at him. That's actually pretty neat. It reduces my weight, Sage said, voice tight. Earl barked a laugh. Kinda useless outside of this, but hey, at least it has one use. Sage didn't respond. Instead, he pulled up his health bar. HP, 140/390. His jaw tightened. He hadn't expected it to hurt this much. Damage in games had always been abstract. Just numbers ticking down on a screen, nothing more. This was different. Every movement reminded him that this wasn't some game. This was real with painful and deadly consequences. But if Earl hadn't rushed in like an idiot, none of this would have happened. He wouldn't be injured. He wouldn't be dealing with this. Sage's gaze flicked sideways. Charging the salamander head-on. That fucking moron. They broke through the last stretch of swamp, the trees thinning until the wooden palisade of Camp Persistence came into view. Rough-hewn logs rose into a defensive wall. Earl slowed. Well, he said, shifting Sage slightly. This is your stop. Sage grunted and pulled away, forcing himself upright. The sudden loss of support made the world tilt for half a second, but he steadied. Yeah, he said as he walked away on his own. Earl didn't seem to care. He rolled his shoulders and glanced back toward the swamp. Guess I'll head back out, he said. Plenty more things to kill. Sage walked away without another word and made his way toward the gate, each step more painful than the last. Behind him, Earl was already moving, disappearing back into the swamp with barely a pause. That reckless fool. The gate creaked open as Sage approached. Two guards stepped out, brows furrowed. You're back already, one of them asked. We thought you left for good. I was injured fighting a salamander, Sage said flatly. I need healing. He didn't slow and they moved aside as he passed between them. The moment he crossed fully into the camp, Sage's body snapped backward as if struck by an invisible force. He slammed into the ground hard, the impact knocking the breath from his lungs. Pain followed, sharp and violent, erupting through his body like burning shrapnel ripping through him all at once. His flesh burned, his ears rang, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. What? He coughed, dragging in air as the sensation faded just enough for him to think. His entire body trembled as he mentally pulled up his health bar. HP, 85/390. His eyes widened as he looked around in a panic. What? Where did that damage come from? The guards rushed over, hauling him back to his feet. You all right? One asked. Sage winced as they lifted him, his body protesting the movement. Healer, he said through clenched teeth. Now. They didn't argue. With one on each side, they half-carried him through the camp toward a small wooden structure tucked near the center. The building was crude, little more than planks hammered together, but it was enough. They pushed through the entrance of the medical hut. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of herbs and something faintly metallic. A few rough wooden beds lined the walls, each occupied. Sage's gaze flicked across the room. And stopped. Kyle lay on one of the beds, unnaturally still. A clean strip of cloth wrapped tightly around where his leg used to be. Sage's eyes lingered for half a second before he looked away. At least he isn't awake. The guards lowered Sage onto one of the crude wooden tables, the rough surface digging into his back. He suppressed a grimace as he shifted slightly, trying to find a position that didn't aggravate everything. Footsteps hurried toward him. Sage! Amanda rushed to his side, her expression tight with concern as her eyes swept over him. What happened? She asked quickly. How did you? Later, Sage cut in, his voice thinner than he would have liked. Hard to talk. Amanda hesitated, then nodded. Right. Just hold still. As if I have a choice. She placed her hands near his torso and began muttering under her breath, words too soft and quick to make out clearly. A pale green glow gathered around her fingers. Sage watched her through half-lidded eyes. He scoffed internally. Why rely on words? Why not just force the mana through your channels directly? It was a slow and inefficient way to cast a spell. Then again, not everyone had his control. Not everyone had been given a rare class. The system had recognized his potential from the start. She probably couldn't cast without chanting. Amanda's magic settled over him, seeping into his body. There was a strange pressure in his chest, then it released as his bones shifted beneath his skin. A sharp pop echoed faintly from his ribs. Then another and another. Sage inhaled sharply as his chest expanded more easily than it had since the fight. That was so much better. Amanda exhaled in relief. There we go, your ribs should be mostly mended now. Her brow furrowed as she examined him more closely. You've got burns too, she said. Fresh ones. What happened out there? Sage opened his mouth to answer. The door creaked open. Both of them turned toward the sound as Richard stepped inside. He wore the same placid smile as always, his movements unhurried and controlled. His gaze swept briefly over the room before settling on Sage. Amanda straightened slightly. Richard, I didn't expect. Is he stable? Richard asked calmly. Amanda blinked, then nodded quickly. Yes. He'll be fine. Just needs some rest and a bit more healing. Good, Richard said, inclining his head slightly. Then I would like a few moments alone with him. Amanda hesitated, just briefly, then nodded again. Of course. She stepped back, gesturing for the other healer to follow. Within seconds, they were gone, the door closing softly behind them. Silence settled over the hut. Richard didn't speak immediately. He waited, listening as the faint sounds of the camp filtered in from outside. Only when he was certain the other patients were still unconscious and no one lingered nearby did he turn his attention back to Sage. How did your little excursion go? He asked lightly. Sage narrowed his eyes, choosing to remain silent. Richard's smile didn't change. I must admit, he continued, I'm a bit surprised to see you back so soon. Less than a day, wasn't it? His gaze drifted over Sage's body, taking in the injuries, the faint scorch marks along his body. A soft tisk escaped his mouth. Sage's irritation flared. What? He asked. Richard tilted his head slightly. It appears, he said mildly, that you may have violated the terms of our contract. His words clicked into place in Sage's mind. The fight with the salamander. The compressed earth had erupted outward when the creature broke free. Fragments had scattered in all directions and some of them had struck Earl. Sage's eyes widened as the realization settled. That blast of burning pain he felt when entering Camp Persistence hadn't been a random attack out of nowhere. Richard watched the understanding dawn with quiet interest. Sage's jaw tightened. Even accidental damage counted? What kind of fucked up contract did he sign? Richard's voice remained calm, almost conversational. It is an effective deterrent, he said. Ensures cooperation. Prevents unfortunate incidents for all involved. Sage said nothing. His mind was already moving. The contract had a restriction but a localized one. He hadn't experienced any backlash while outside the camp. Only once he crossed the camp's threshold did he suffer consequences. Now, Richard continued, stepping a little closer, I believe you understand the importance of restraint. Sage met his gaze, eyes sharp despite his condition. I understand, he said. Richard studied him for a moment, his placid smile unwavering. Good. Then since you'll be staying here I'll reinstate the contract. It's been less than 48 hours so you don't even need to lift a finger. Sage saw Richard's eyes glaze over for half a second as he paused. Then Richard spoke again, his tone softening just slightly. You've had a difficult outing, he said. And you're clearly not in any condition to return to the wilds just yet. Sage felt something brush against his mind. It was subtle and smooth, a thought not entirely his own, yet one he found himself agreeing with. You should remain within the walls for a few days, Richard continued. Rest and recover. Reconnect with your group. The pressure increased. Sage felt it more clearly now. Something was pushing against his mind. He felt his thoughts begin to dull. Maybe I should stay a while. I do need to rest and recover. It would be so much easier here, safer. Sage's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Something felt off but he couldn't pin down what. He focused inward, anchoring himself to the steady flow of his own mana emanating out of his core. Going back out like this would be inefficient. An unnecessary risk while he was injured. Sage kept his expression neutral as he let the thoughts wash over him. A few days, he said slowly. Richard's smile widened just a fraction. Yes, he said. Just until you've recovered. Then you can try going out again and fight monsters to your heart's content. Sage inclined his head slightly. Yeah, that sounds good, he said. Richard held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded. Good, he said quietly. By the time Sage stepped out of the medical hut, the sun had already dipped below the treeline. Cool air brushed against his skin, carrying the scent of fire, damp wood, and faint traces of cooked meat. The camp had settled into a quieter rhythm. Fires burned low, voices muted, movements slower. He rolled his shoulders as he walked. The sharp edge of his injuries had dulled into a manageable ache. His breathing came easier now, no longer catching on every inhale. Sage made his way through the camp, his gaze drifting over the layout. The wooden palisades. The ramshackle buildings. The clusters of people gathered around small fires. Staying here for a few days wasn't a bad idea. His steps slowed as he spotted them. His group sat gathered around a modest fire, its glow flickering across their faces. For a moment, he simply watched them talk and laugh together. Then he stepped closer and heads turned. He met their gaze and the shift was immediate. The easy conversation died as he approached, and silence settled over the group. About damn time you showed up, Kranti called out, breaking the tension. We thought you were dead or something. A few quiet chuckles followed, though they carried an edge. Amanda must have told them he was back. We heard you ended up in the medical hut, Brian added. What happened? Sage didn't answer immediately. Instead, he accepted the thin wooden slab Nadine offered him, a few chunks of roasted meat resting on its surface. As she handed it over, she shot Brian a brief, warning look before turning back to Sage. Eat, she said simply. He took it without hesitation and lowered himself onto a nearby log. The first bite was better than expected. The conversation slowly resumed around him, though it took a few minutes for the tension to fully fade. They spoke of small things at first. Of life before the system. Familiar stories retold in quieter voices. Sage listened more than he spoke. He'd been gone less than a day, but he'd missed this. Time passed. The fire burned lower, embers replacing flame. One by one, members of the group stood, stretching, muttering quiet goodnights as they drifted off toward their sleeping spots. Eventually, only two remained. Sage and Nadine. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the soft crackle of dying embers. Nadine shifted slightly, her gaze fixed on the fire. We should talk, she said finally. Sage leaned back slightly, resting his weight against the log. About, he asked. About the fact that you left without saying anything. Her eyes lifted then, meeting his directly. Why? For a moment, Sage said nothing. Then he looked away, his jaw tightening. I thought the group was holding me back. He exhaled slowly. This place, the tutorial, this system, I see it as an opportunity, he continued. An opportunity we need to take advantage of. If this is just the tutorial, then we need to grow stronger. His gaze drifted toward the dark beyond the camp. I didn't think waiting around here was the best way to progress. Nadine's hands clenched slightly in her lap. So you just left, she said. Without even saying goodbye. I thought you and everyone else would try to stop me. I thought I'd do better on my own, he said. Or with someone stronger. Someone who could keep up with my ambition. With my rare class. And? Nadine asked quietly. Sage huffed softly. And I was wrong. That got her attention. He leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees. Fighting with Earl, the guy I left with, was inefficient, he said. We had no coordination. There was no structure to how he fought. He just rushed into nearly every fight and hoped it worked out. His lip curled faintly. Clearly it didn't. He glanced at her. With you all, it was different. I didn't have to think about every little thing. Brian held the line. You covered angles. Professor Sanders called out the tactics. I could focus on controlling the field and doing damage. I didn't realize all of that until it wasn't there. The fire crackled softly between them. I won't leave like that again, Sage added. Nadine studied him for a long moment. Some of the tension in her shoulders eased, but he could tell something still bothered her. Good, she said finally. Silence settled between them again. Nadine shifted slightly, fidgeting with the edge of her leather armor. There's something else, she said. Sage glanced at her. She hesitated, then met his gaze again. It's about Cade. Sage stilled as he felt the blood drain from his face. You told the group he died, she continued. That those men had just killed him out of nowhere. Her eyes sharpened. That wasn't the truth, was it? Sage's expression hardened slightly. How would you know that? He asked. Nadine met his eyes. I was there, she said. I heard everything that happened between you two that night. I know that he wasn't killed by those two men. I know that he left because of what you said. Because he didn't want to be a burden on the group. Sage's eyes widened. You what? You and Cade were too busy arguing to notice me, she said. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop at first. I couldn't sleep, so I was using my stealth skill to test its limits. Then I overheard the two of you arguing. Sage stared at her for a moment, letting the silence linger. Why didn't you say anything before? He asked, his gaze dropping to the dying fire. Nadine's expression flickered. I assumed you had your reasons. There was always tension between you two, even before the tutorial, she said. Heat crept up Sage's neck, darkening the skin beneath his cheeks as he looked away. It's complicated, he muttered. Nadine leaned back slightly, crossing her arms. Then explain it to me. It's not like I have anything better to do, she said. Before Sage could answer, the embers dimmed just enough that the shadows around them seemed to deepen, stretching longer across the ground. Nadine's posture stiffened. Sage felt it a second later, a subtle shift in the air. A presence that had not been there before. Someone was standing just beyond the edge of the light. Richard stepped forward from the dark as though he had been there the entire time, his expression as calm and unreadable as ever. The orange glow of the embers caught the edge of his face, leaving the rest swallowed in shadow. Neither of them had heard him approach. Richard's ever-present smile widened. I believe the two of you may be interested in a proposition. Something cold slid down Sage's spine. Nadine's eyes narrowed. A proposition. Richard inclined his head. You're both ambitious. Capable. More perceptive than most of the others here. His gaze moved between them. And I find myself in need of people who can recognize opportunity when it presents itself. Richard took another step closer, his polished calm unwavering. There are changes coming to Camp Persistence, he said. Unfortunate ones. Growing pains, you might say. The sort that could be very dangerous for those caught unprepared. The night around them felt suddenly quieter. Even the crackle of the embers seemed distant. Nadine's posture remained stiff. What kind of changes? The kind that creates a unique opportunity for growth. Sage felt something brush against his mind again. That same gentle pressure as before slipped through his thoughts like silk drawn over a blade. A quiet weight settled behind his eyes, warm and inviting. The instinct to resist rose immediately, but before it could bloom his thoughts dulled beneath the soft insistence of something not entirely his own. Richard's voice remained calm. When the time comes, I'd like to offer both of you a chance to be on the right side of what happens next.